Hey everyone, welcome to another exciting adventure. Today, Audio Novel presents Frieren, Reincarnated as a Demon by A. Light. And if you're looking for more amazing stories, don't forget to check out my Patreon page. Your support helps turn incredible tales like this one into fully immersive audiobooks. Join me on this journey, and together, we can bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of the adventure. Let's begin. Chapter 60, The Master and Disciple in True Heart Exchange. In Siri's private reception room at the Continental Magic Association branch, a routine meeting was underway. But the meeting was only halfway through when the door to the reception room was kicked open. When everyone looked over, the newcomer had an arrogant expression as if he was prepared to challenge someone, but he suddenly froze, unable to finish his words. Because the moment the door was kicked open, Ash saw, from afar, a small figure sitting untidily on the large wooden chair at the end of the room. It was clearly Siri herself. Siri, who had also been startled by the loud noise of the door crashing open, raised her eyes and noticed Ash's expression gradually stiffening. The corners of her mouth curled up, revealing a wide grin. Sorry, wrong room. Ash quickly apologized, stepping forward in a flash to pick up the damaged door handle and reassemble it carefully. After finishing all of this in one swift motion, he managed an awkward but polite smile, nodded at everyone in the room, and said, "Please, continue. Don't mind me." With those words, and while everyone in the room was still in a daze, he closed the broken door once more. But just as he turned around, breathed a sigh of relief, and wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, ready to leave quickly. "Where do you think you're going, my dear disciple?" Someone pressed down firmly on his shoulder, and a familiar voice sounded very close behind him. Teleportation. That's a bit unnerving. Ash sighed, patting his face as he tried to calm himself down. Then, he slowly turned around, wearing a smile as if meeting her for the first time, and looked at the petite figure floating slightly above the ground. With a hint of forced surprise, he said, "Oh. Isn't this my esteemed master, Siri? How long has it been?" 1,000 years, right? I never imagined I'd see you here. What a truly fortuitous encounter. TSK, still pretending, Siri clicked her tongue shamelessly. "Do you think that if you act as though you're seeing me for the first time, I'll let you off as if nothing happened?" "Let me off? What are you talking about? Don't we have a special bond?" he tried, attempting to tap into their past connection, hoping to strike a chord. But Siri dismissed him coldly. "A bond? We haven't seen each other for 1,000 years. What bond could there be?" Those words really sting, don't they? I missed you terribly, every day. No news for 1,000 years. Is that really what you care about? This doesn't seem like you. Indeed, Siri nodded thoughtfully, which made him smile with a sliver of hope. "Well, to celebrate our reunion as master and disciple, why don't we? Don't be too pleased with yourself. Since you're here, I trust you've come prepared." "Prepared for what exactly?" "Let's see the progress you've made over the past 1,000 years, and then we can talk about your compensation." "Compensation? For the door? I don't, wait." With a stiff smile, he tried to continue, but as he saw the magical energy gathering in Siri's hands, he felt a sudden, cold sweat run down his back. A terrifying smile appeared on the face of the ancient elf at that moment, and then, boom! An explosion erupted in the building of the Magic Association. Ash's figure darted through the flames, not to fight, but to escape. After all, as long as the Green Mountains remain, there's no fear of running out of firewood. But the explosions continued one after another, showing no sign of stopping. "Don't let anyone get hurt, okay? Otherwise, let's just keep going." As the warning reached his ears, the entire building was destroyed in the blink of an eye, with even the outer walls collapsing. The barriers set up around it offered no resistance, succumbing easily to the terrifying energy. However, when everything finally calmed down, the scene was strangely shocking. Even if we overlook the smoke and dust, the flames that shot into the sky nearly flew over 100 meters high. The energy impact should have turned everything within hundreds of meters into ruins, creating a horrific massacre. But in reality, only the Magic Association was damaged, and the area outside remained unaffected. As an authoritative organization that had gained fame across the continent in a short period, it seemed almost impossible for such a devastating attack to occur within the Continental Magic Association. However, the impossible had happened, and no one even stood up to prevent this tragedy. No, those who would truly have the courage to intervene would probably end up as pieces of meat flying through the air in the next moment. Usually, the building was filled with staff members, yet the actual number of deaths was 0. And the only person injured was one. Covered in dust and blood, looking extremely disheveled, Ash was the only casualty in this incident. "What have I done to deserve coming to this damn place for no reason?" he muttered, lifting the wall behind him. He felt that this level of violence was borderline abuse. He turned around to face the elf who was leisurely walking toward him, and complained. "What on earth are you doing? There has to be a limit to everything, okay? If it weren't for me, someone would have died." "No one died, right? And I did hold back, so let's consider this a test for you. Is your magic association finished?" "It's okay. Isn't it time for you to pay compensation?" "Wait a minute. I only broke a door, right?" He looked at the magic association, now in ruins, and an ominous premonition rose in his mind. He eyed the girl standing before him warily. "You're not thinking of..." "That's it." Siri's smile was so bright it nearly made him curse. "No, I. It was going to be demolished and expanded anyway, and now that you're here, there's someone to pay for it." "But how about my position?" Before he could refuse, Siri threw out a great temptation. Although this organization was established not long ago, it's considered a good one among human organizations. "What do you think? This is my compensation for accidentally injuring you. If it were anyone else, I wouldn't give away my hard work so freely." "No, wait a minute, let me sort this out first." After enduring another round of Siri's unexpected attacks, Ash found himself thrown off by the sudden shift to kindness. With a hand on his forehead, he sat quietly, deep in thought. Finally, he looked up, still cautious, and voiced his suspicions. "First, you suddenly hit me, and now you're offering all these benefits. Something doesn't add up." "Think about it," Siri replied with a charming smile, hands spread wide, her tone suddenly gentle and persuasive. "If I just hand you authority, no one under me will accept it. But if you step up and show your strength, especially by saving them, they'll respect you. I'm paving the way for you. This is the true master-disciple relationship you've always talked about, isn't it? I'm passing the organization I built to you." "That doesn't sound right. You're just tired of managing all of this, aren't you? So you took out your frustration on me and then pushed all your hard work onto me, calling it an inheritance." Wiping blood and dust from his face, Ash sighed with exasperation, then glanced at her, utterly baffled. "You clearly despise all these annoying responsibilities. So why come out here yourself? Is this to honor some disciple's last wish from 1,000 years ago? Since when did you become so thoughtful?" "Ha, only you dare to talk nonsense to me like that," Siri laughed, shaking her head, a hint of amusement dancing in her eyes. "Nonsense? Really? And yet, Oh." Siri's smile turned icy, a fierce gleam in her eyes that made him stop mid-sentence and swallow his words. Actually, I just remembered something urgent I need to do back home. So, can I take my leave for today?" Ash, who had been feigning injury on the ground, suddenly straightened up, patting himself off as if to casually slip away. Surprisingly, Siri didn't try to stop him. But as he neared a broken section of the wall, he suddenly saw her standing there, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him. Startled, he instinctively took 2 steps back. "Are you a ghost? How do you keep appearing out of nowhere? What's the rush? We haven't seen each other in so long, and now you're running off already. That's not very reasonable, is it?" Actually, I was planning to go into town to buy some gifts, as a gesture. Since it's been so long, a bit of courtesy seems appropriate, right?" "I don't care." "Well, I do." "Nonsense. Actually, I think I lost too much blood. Feeling a bit lightheaded now. I'm not sure I can even stand straight." Dramatically, Ash staggered, collapsing onto the ground once more, covering his head and feigning severe weakness. "Siri." I really don't think I can keep this up. Maybe I should rest a bit first, and then we can talk about everything. Oh, so you really can't hold out? Yes. After all, you beat me up so badly. Not that I'm blaming you for it, of course. You're my master, right? Spare me the emotional nonsense. Siri interrupted sharply, eyeing him with a cold laugh as she pointed out, and isn't that blood mostly just chicken blood? That you smear it on yourself when I wasn't looking. Chapter 61, Who is More Evil? Half a century has come in the blink of an eye. Underscore. It wasn't at the moment of being attacked, but when he encountered Siri that Ash had a premonition he was in big trouble. Under the cover of the explosion and smoke, he dashed into the kitchen without a word, smearing some blood on himself to make his injuries appear worse in hopes of gaining some sympathy. However, TSK. Did she actually see through it? Even though his act had been exposed, he wasn't embarrassed in the slightest. After all, the other party was this cunning individual. Smacking his lips, he muttered, "The old ones really are the wisest." That saying makes so much sense. You don't have to resist so much. I won't force you, Siri tried to persuade him with a gentle tone, attempting to appeal to his better nature. But then I refuse. Without a moment's hesitation, he declined bluntly and unapologetically. Siri's expression, which had softened a bit, immediately grew cold again. What do you mean by that? Rejecting me so quickly, are you not even going to give me the slightest respect? Well. After a brief pause, he looked around, then took out a scrap of paper and a pen from the rubble, scribbling a series of words before handing it over respectfully. What's this? Siri took the paper, frowning after only a quick glance. The note read. As I take up my pen, my heart is filled with gratitude and admiration. Since I began learning magic, I have been deeply grateful for Master's careful guidance. Not only have you taught me all you know about magic, but you have also given me endless inspiration on how to live with honor. Your wisdom, patience, and noble character are like a beacon illuminating my path forward. I am beyond words in expressing my gratitude for all your efforts. Yet, after careful reflection, when I face the precious legacy you wish to pass to me, my heart is filled with complex emotions and inner struggles. The entire note was basically flattery, loaded with flowery and insincere clichés that made Siri's head throb. She glanced between the letter and his overly polite smile, her mouth twisting with irritation. In the next instant, she tore the note into pieces, threw it to the ground, and snapped, "What have you been doing these past 1,000 years? Learning aristocratic nonsense? Spare me this rubbish and just say it to my face. Then I refuse." You. Siri's face darkened dangerously. Sensing he might have pushed too far, Ash quickly rose, crouched down in front of her, and placed his hands gently on her shoulders, his expression suddenly solemn. Actually, we can talk this out peacefully. Or, maybe take a moment to calm down first. Oh. I'm listening. What else do you have to say? Well, isn't it obvious? He glanced at her. What's the point of all this? What do you mean? Of course, I refused. Why should I take over this mess? That farewell note wasn't meant for me, right? Facing Siri's warning glare, he went on, almost lecturing her. Look, I'm not saying anything against you personally, but just handing over Flam's legacy to someone else isn't wise. If things go south, her spirit. I've already tested your strength, Siri interrupted. An ordinary first-level magician would have been finished by now. This isn't a casual matter. You have potential, trust yourself. Aren't you afraid I might still fail? He asked, then, as if he didn't care to hear a response, sighed and continued, let's set this aside for now. Honestly, I have my own matters to attend to. There's really no way I can take this on. Then tell me, what exactly are you planning to do? Siri had been reluctant to go out and personally build up a force, so she had delayed fulfilling Flam's will for just a little while. Now that she saw Ash as a prime candidate for free labor, she naturally had no intention of letting him slip away so easily. But since he seemed so unwilling, she softened her stance slightly. She didn't intend to force him, but her gaze urged him to explain himself. Yet, without a solid reason, it was clear she wasn't going to let him off the hook. Ash admitted he'd taken control of the kingdom and planned to manage it to build strength, but Siri's reaction was ambiguous, a mix of agreement and reluctance. While she didn't seem intent on pushing him further, her expectations lingered. "You've really come a long way, haven't you? You're in control of an entire kingdom now." Siri lounged on a wooden chair amid the ruins, crossing her legs with a mischievous smile. "Then the reconstruction and expansion here can be entirely your responsibility. Show me how much you value your teacher. That's the people's hard-earned money. I'm not about to bleed the civilians dry." "Civilians?" Siri scoffed. "How much money do you think they have? Why not ask the nobles to contribute? You've got plenty of them under your thumb, right? This place will belong to you eventually, so why not improve it? But I don't even want to take over this mess in the first place. This is just—" "I won't force you," Siri said, though her tone carried a weight that made him sigh. "Honestly, you really are a devil." "Oh, coming from a demon who manipulates others?" Siri retorted with a smirk, leaving him momentarily speechless. In terms of behavior and reputation, it was hard to deny that he might seem even more devilish. In the end, Ash, who'd come only to deal with a few lingering issues, found himself in a bind. He was effectively roped into staying in the magical city to help organize the establishment of a branch of the Continental Magic Association. Those he'd saved within the Magic Association began to view him as Siri's future successor and the branch leader, or even as a very generous noble patron. Along with his titles, he also gained access to Siri's extensive collection of magical books. Faced with the chance to read all the magical knowledge in the world, money suddenly seemed a lot less valuable. Years slipped by as he continued his studies and managed responsibilities under Siri's watchful eye. Ash even took over the Demon King's castle, which had been abandoned, but in just the first year of his rule, he faced a formidable challenger, the bloody god of war, Rivali, one of the most ancient and powerful demons in existence. What a great successor! No wonder they dared to take over this place. The demon warrior, Rivali, with slick back hair, prominent horns, and thick eyebrows, laughed with genuine excitement when he saw Ash. Channeling his magic power into a colossal sword, he swung it down at Ash without a word. Bang! The massive sword clashed with Ash's own long sword, sending sparks flying. Ash, thrown backward by the impact, skidded at a frightening speed. Yet, in the midst of his uncontrolled retreat, he managed to plant a firm step forward, stabilizing himself just in time. Behind him, the force of the collision had torn up the ground, creating a dramatic, inverted waterfall of earth and stone. Rivali's grin widened with approval. Laughing heartily, he called out, "Not bad. You've got some real grit. That dwarf, Eisen, couldn't even stand his ground after one punch from me, but you, after taking a blow from my sword, you're still in control." "I've heard of you," Ash muttered, visibly frustrated. Rivali, who seemed to live for combat, looked at Ash with eyes ablaze with anticipation. "Come on, young man. Defeat me in a show of strength, and I, this old warrior, will recognize you as the new Demon King." "Wait. Are you serious? I'm a magician. You, a warrior, want me to fight you in hand-to-hand combat?" Ash looked at Rivali, completely taken aback. He couldn't fathom how Rivali could make such a demand. "A magician? You seem more like a warrior to me. Besides, no ordinary magician could have blocked my sword. My specialty is magic. I just know a bit of martial arts, that's all," Ash replied, scratching his head. "How about this, why don't you teach me how to fight? Then I'll get better, and you'll have a real challenge." Sounds like a plan." Rivali didn't hesitate long before nodding with delight, muttering to himself as if he'd found a brilliant idea. "Personally train an outstanding junior, then have them surpass me in every way, that sounds perfect." I only suggested it, but you actually agreed?" Ash asked, incredulous. "Why search the world for rivals when I can train one right here? And frankly, I can't think of anyone more suited for this than you. Even if you call yourself a magician, that power you wield, no ordinary human could dream of such strength." Rivali sized him up, then lifted his sword once more, his smile growing ever more bloodthirsty. "Come on, let me teach you." "Wait, this doesn't seem like teaching. The fastest way to learn is in real combat." Rivali's giant sword came down with immense power. Ash could only smile wryly, unsure what expression to wear. All he could do was grit his teeth and dive into the fight. Thus began the days that followed. Ash found himself studying magic under Siri's strict guidance while training as a warrior under Rivali's brutal regimen. With such a relentless schedule, time slipped by quickly. In the blink of an eye, the 50-year agreement loomed ever closer. One evening, while taking a rare break, Ash sat atop the wall of the Demon King's castle, gazing at the distant night sky. He thought of the appointment he'd made half a century ago. His heart felt heavy, unsure if he should fulfill that promise. After all, there were fewer friends now. And this time, he might be nearing the limits of human lifespan. Chapter 62, Reunion with an Old Friend. If someone else ended up dying during a date, Ash would be thoroughly depressed. But skipping out didn't feel right either. After all, this was an arrangement with a friend. So, he sighed as he sat on the city wall, feeling endlessly conflicted, unable to make up his mind. Just then, Rivali appeared beside him without a sound, and before Ash could react. What? You've pushed your martial arts to the very pinnacle of human ability. One more step, and you'd be on par with me. Yet here you are, with that unwarrior-like expression. Rivali slapped him on the back without a hint of restraint, the impact resounding with a loud bang and nearly sending Ash tumbling off the wall. Ash shot the old man a frustrated look, but Rivali only grinned back, leaving him at a loss for words. For a moment, Ash couldn't help but think that these powerful demons didn't seem quite like demons at all. Aura, he could understand, given that he'd essentially raised them, it was natural for them to be a little unusual. But Rivali? He lacked any fear of death and had an unyielding passion for battle, an attitude that defied demon instincts. Yes, Rivali had absolutely no fear in battle. This was something the dwarf warrior Eisen, who had once fought him, could attest to. It was said that Rivali's strength had reached a level of martial prowess that humans couldn't hope to achieve. Even though Rivali had used an axe to fight Eisen, he was still far beyond the pinnacle that Eisen had reached. Although Ash hadn't witnessed their fight, he'd heard from his companions that Rivali's skill was terrifying, even outmatching Eisen's. His martial arts abilities were beyond anything a human could comprehend. Eisen's special moves had only scratched Rivali's face, and his regular attacks hadn't harmed him at all. His body was astoundingly durable, harder even than that of a dragon. However, his single-minded focus on fighting and lack of fear had allowed Eisen to seize an opportunity, knocking him off a cliff with a special attack, and even managing to cut his face. But that was the extent of it, nothing else could harm him. His strength was simply monstrous. Of course, none of this was particularly relevant to the situation now, but it made him quite suited to be a teacher. As for his appearance, he was just a quirky uncle with slick back hair, standing over 2 meters tall, always smiling. So Ash just turned to look at him. When Rivali gazed back with a curious look, Ash was convinced, if he ever went to watch meteors with Frieren and the others again, it definitely wouldn't be with this strange uncle at this castle. As for Siri, he figured he could skip that too. And Aura, well, that was just a shadow of the past. Watching meteors with Siri or Aura isn't all that different from watching with Rivali. Meteors. Also, the 50-year meteor shower is about to happen again, isn't it? Do you want to watch meteors with me? Rivali asked, his curiosity piqued as he overheard his name. To Rivali, it didn't seem like much, but... Ash's expression turned to one of pure resistance. No, the very thought is disturbing, so let's not. Why not? 2 grown men, sitting side by side, in the middle of the night, watching shooting stars. Can't you imagine how odd that would look? Why, it's the friendship of warriors. Rivali replied without hesitation, leaving Ash speechless. After a long silence, Ash held his forehead with one hand and sighed, "All right, I admit it, I'm a bit old-fashioned. Please forgive me." "Ah. You're forgiven. So let's fight again. This time, I'll only use one hand. No weapons, and I won't even go full strength." "Huh? What are you talking about?" "I was thinking, whoa." Before Ash could finish, Rivali's fist, practically the size of a casserole pot, smashed into his face without a shred of mercy. Caught completely off guard, he took the full brunt of the punch, his body flung from the wall like a cannonball, landing heavily on the ground. Not surprisingly, all his troubles vanished under that crushing blow. Though helpless against a berserker like Rivali, Ash resolved through this brutal exchange that he would witness the final moments of his old friend. So, the very next day, with a face bruised and body battered, he flew straight to the Central Kingdoms at full speed. There was simply no other option. Healing magic was a privilege of the goddess, available only to those who possessed the Holy Scriptures, primarily priests. Unfortunately, as a demon, even holding the Scriptures wouldn't grant him access to healing. The goddess had clearly shown her disdain, unwilling to extend even a trace of favor to him. Returning to the capital after half a century felt like a lifetime for Ash, still a young demon. New buildings had sprung up, and the streets had changed slightly, but 50 years wasn't enough to bring drastic transformations to a city of this era. He tried to recall the direction to Himmel's home. Wait, I don't remember any of it. He'd only been to Himmel's home once, 50 years ago, so his memory was hazy, leaving him wandering through the city's maze of streets and alleys. On top of that, a barrier in the capital prohibited flight, making his situation even more frustrating. He even considered casting some magic into the sky to catch someone's attention, hoping an acquaintance might notice him. Ash. Is that you? An unfamiliar, aged voice spoke from behind, prompting Ash to turn around instinctively. And you are? He looked back to see an old man with a bald head, long white beard, a blue cloak, and a cane. The man studied Ash with the same curiosity Ash had. Are you? Relying on the mole at the corner of his eye, Ash ventured, with uncertainty, Himmel. Ha. Your surprised face is as amusing as Frieren's, Himmel chuckled, stroking his overgrown beard with a warm smile. No, hang on a second. What's wrong? Weren't you shorter than Frieren? Have you finally given up being human and switched professions to dwarf? Staring at the old man who barely reached his shoulder, Ash couldn't conceal his shock and blurted out without thinking. After all, while people may shrink with age, they don't normally become this short. Himmel had shrunk by half a meter, enough that it seemed like a real transformation. After all, while people may shrink with age, they don't typically become this short. Himmel was nearly half a meter shorter than before, so much so that he genuinely seemed like he'd transformed into something else. Himmel's look of shock made him burst into laughter. You really haven't changed at all. You're still as blunt as ever. But don't you think it's a bit much to say that again? No, this definitely isn't normal. What's abnormal is how you've stayed exactly the same. Himmel looked him up and down with a smile. Honestly, it makes me miss you. Seeing you and Frieren together brings back memories of our adventures 50 years ago. Though, you were always absent at the crucial moments, as if you were just stopping by. Well. I'm still weak, after all. Really. Even if Eisen in his prime faced you now, he might not win in close combat, right? Is that so? He didn't respond directly, speaking instead with a vague, confused expression. With a soft sigh, Himmel remarked, even though Eisen has aged, you haven't shown any signs of decline. Truly fitting for a great magician from the mythological era, able to create magic like this. It really is amazing. By the way, how old are you now? Oh, a little over 100. Really? That's quite something. Anyway, let's not just stand here chatting. Come to my house, let's sit down and catch up properly. Himmel seemed delighted to see his long-lost friend. He didn't want to bring up anything that might spoil the mood. Smiling, he led him through the streets and alleys to the house that had remained unchanged over the past 50 years. Along the way, they continued to talk, and Himmel mentioned that Frieren hadn't visited even once in all these years. As to why, well. Every year at our reunion, there are only 3 of us. The 2 of you never show up, almost as if you'd made a pact to avoid it. We sometimes wonder if you've forgotten about us. No, nothing like that, truly. Himmel's slightly resentful tone made him look away in embarrassment, his feelings mixed. It wasn't that he hadn't wanted to come. He'd intended to visit 25 years ago to say farewell to Siri, but she had coldly rejected him. Humans are different from us. Their lives are as fleeting as a blooming flower. Even if the relationship is strong, what's the point? It only leads to wasted time and needless troubles. Don't go. This was the thought that came to mind as he looked at Himmel's face. But seeing his elderly friend now, he couldn't help but wonder why Siri had taken on so many human students if she felt that way. In facing this old friend, as frail as a flickering candle, he began to understand what Siri had meant. As a hero who once saved the world, Himmel's home was surprisingly modest, just a simple, ordinary house. He lit a fire in the fireplace like any elderly person would and took a seat first. Watching him, he realized that Himmel was now a true old man. What's wrong? Do you want to try it too? Himmel, gently rocking back and forth in his chair, noticed his gaze on it and asked with a teasing smile, "Shall I get up so you can try it?" Chapter 63, Himmel's Silent Trust of Frieren, Humans Are Really Strange. ______. Seeing how Ash kept glancing at the rocking chair, Himmel, as if understanding his thoughts, placed both hands on the chair and began to move it aside to make room for him. Himmel looked every bit like a grandfather lecturing a stubborn grandchild, so Ash quickly stepped forward and gently held him back, firmly denying, No, I'm just curious. I don't actually want to sit down. At most, I'm just feeling a bit nostalgic. After all, you're just an ordinary old man now. Haha, what nonsense, Himmel chuckled, shaking his head with a warm smile. I might still be quite charming for my age, but yes, I'm just an ordinary old man now. However, it seems you haven't changed a bit. That's true, Ash admitted with a nod. By the way, Himmel continued, you're here for the promise we made 50 years ago, aren't you? Of course. Well, so is Frieren. She arrived 3 days ago, though I haven't seen her since. Apparently, she left town to retrieve something, heaven knows where she's gone. Himmel sighed but smiled, adding with a teasing glint, even though you two have been pretty heartless, never once visiting us, I'm relieved you're not so heartless as to forget our agreement. Sorry. I've just been really busy lately. Ash muttered, feeling slightly guilty about the long absence, as though his old friend's transformation into a dwarf had been kept a secret on purpose. He felt a pang of remorse. Haha. I'm only kidding. Don't take it so seriously, Himmel reassured him, his smile kind. To be honest, though, we did worry we might never see you again in this lifetime. It's a blessing to have this chance now. Just being able to see you again brings us such joy. Is that really enough to make you happy? Ash murmured, feeling a bit unworthy of such warmth, even though he wasn't human at all. Himmel just looked at him with that same gentle, nostalgic smile, reminiscing before he returned to the matter at hand. When Frieren came, I wrote to Haider and Eisen. They've been in the country for the past few years, and they'll meet us at the city gate tomorrow morning. With an elderly slowness and calm, Himmel added, So, tell me what you've been up to these past 50 years. It's a rare chance to catch up for an old man like me. After all, you don't have any other commitments here, do you? Well, I really don't. I've mostly just been training, Ash admitted with a slight shrug. I can tell, Himmel said, nodding. You've made remarkable progress in every respect. But. No, it's nothing. If you're already approaching the end of your life, why push yourself so hard? And while a human's appearance can be fixed, can the body itself remain unchanged forever? Why do you continue to improve? Himmel didn't voice these questions but instead gently shook his head and looked at Ash with the warmth of an elder observing the younger generation. With a soft smile, he said slowly. You're our friend. So, we've always been a bit curious about what's been going on between you and Frieren during this time. Yeah. Ash found the sudden emphasis on friendship a little unexpected. Coupled with Himmel's previous unspoken question, it felt as though something deeper lingered beneath the surface. But, since Himmel hadn't pressed further, Ash felt no need to explain. After all, there was nothing worth celebrating in his answer. With that thought in mind, he murmured with a hint of reluctance, Nothing too interesting has happened to me over the years. Does it really matter? Oh, it's fine, just tell me. Well, are you familiar with the Continental Magic Association? Yes. I've heard of it. That was founded by your master, wasn't it? Unable to turn down the warm encouragement, Ash found himself recounting a story he could share, about the time he unintentionally knocked down a notable figure in a sparring match. The memory, though embarrassing, held a trace of humor, and he couldn't help but laugh at it now. He also shared a bit about his more recent activities, and as the hours passed, the two of them kept talking until evening, eventually heading out together to a tavern for more drinks and conversation. As for Frieren, who had supposedly arrived before him, he never saw her, nor did he know where she'd gone. The next morning, sunlight streamed softly into the room, filling the cold winter living space with a gentle warmth. The smell of firewood burning lingered in the air, bringing a cozy comfort to the house. Ash, having stayed at Himmel's place, settled himself in the rocking chair by the fireplace after washing up. The rhythmic creaking of the chair and the crackling of the firewood beside him created such a soothing atmosphere that he began to understand why Himmel loved this chair so much. He, too, soon lost himself in the peaceful rhythm, his eyes drifting shut. But his quiet was soon interrupted as the living room door creaked open, and a voice from behind, familiar even after half a century, spoke. "Is that Ash?" Dazed, he opened his eyes, blinking as he saw the speaker. Frieren stood there, looking both surprised and intrigued, staring at him. "Why are you here? And what are you doing?" "HM. Ah, do you want to give it a try too?" "And no." Seeing him quickly stand up and offer her the chair, Frieren's instinctive response was to turn down his invitation. It was supposed to be a long-awaited reunion, but watching him lounge so comfortably in the rocking chair, he looked just like Himmel, the elder of the house. It suddenly struck her. Even if Ash's appearance hadn't changed, he seemed, in some intangible way, to have aged, just like Himmel. Though she didn't fully understand what old age should look like in humans, she felt it in the resemblance to Himmel's demeanor. And without meaning to, she found herself asking, "How old are you now?" "A little over 100. 101. Ash answered, reclining comfortably in the rocking chair. "It turns out that if humans are a little lazy, they can really live longer, right?" Frieren replied, crossing her arms as she gave him a sidelong glance. "No, this is still within the normal range, probably," Ash responded with a shrug, looking genuinely uncertain. "Is that so?" Frieren raised an eyebrow at him, observing his relaxed demeanor with an odd expression. Truthfully, she had mentally prepared herself this time for the possibility that Ash might not make it here, or that he might even be gone by now. She had steeled herself countless times, bracing for the worst. Yet every time she thought him lost, Ash would reappear, alive and well, seemingly undeterred by the years passing by. It was a relief each time, but also exhausting. Noticing her expression, Ash couldn't help but tease, "What's with that look? Are you hoping I'll die soon or something?" "How could I? I thought maybe this time I wouldn't see you again." "It's not that I want you gone," she continued, looking away, "but you keep vanishing and reappearing. It's exhausting to think you're lost, only for you to pop back up like this." She crossed her arms, contemplating something, then remarked, "Come to think of it, isn't this Himmel's house? Why are you in his chair?" Ash laughed. "He went to his room to fetch a hairbrush, probably to neaten himself up. He told me to feel free to sit in it until he gets back." "Aha. Just so we're clear, you didn't get into a fight over the chair with him while I was away, did you?" she asked, half seriously, before a thought made her frown. "Wait a second, isn't Himmel bald?" "I didn't ask." "Bald men can be quite persistent about these things." "I think I remember him saying that," Ash replied, shrugging. "I don't get it." "Humans are truly strange," Frieren muttered, shaking her head in mild confusion. She sat opposite him, placing her elbows on the table and resting her chin in one hand as she fixed him with an unhappy stare. "So, what have you been up to for the last 50 years? Word is you were so extreme you didn't even bother visiting anyone." Ash blinked in genuine surprise. "Is that my fault? I thought you'd come to visit. Do you know how sad I was thinking you didn't?" "All right, I'm sorry, okay. I was busy." She bit her lip, frustration creeping into her voice. "It's strange, but 49 years flew by without me noticing." "Wait, no, hold on." She narrowed her eyes in displeasure as realization dawned on her, sensing Ash's usual playful trap. But before she could say more, he waved his hand dismissively. Forget it. I'll let it slide this time. Let's just move on, shall we? But hey, I wouldn't mind if you helped push the chair a little while you're at it. Are you a grandpa now or something? And by the way, you have no right to be lecturing me on visiting." Realizing she'd been tricked, Frieren's face showed reluctant resignation. But, after a sigh and a moment's hesitation, she stood up, moved behind him, and began to rock the chair slowly. In that warm, firelit room, a sense of peace filled the space. Friends reunited, the crackling of the fire mingling with the faint creak of the chair as Frieren gently rocked Ash. For a moment, all felt serene and timeless. When Himmel finally emerged from his room, he paused in the doorway, a slightly baffled smile on his face. Seeing the two of them, Ash nodding off contentedly in the chair, and Frieren almost drifting herself as she rocked him, he was unsure what to say. With a blend of amusement and helplessness, he tapped his cane on the ground gently, breaking the odd, yet somehow perfect tranquility that had enveloped them all. Chapter 64, The Last Journey of the Hero. The old friends are like leaves falling in the wind, withering away. The three of them walked out of the royal capital, shoulder to shoulder. Just beyond the city gate, they spotted two figures waiting by the edge of the city wall, a tall man and a shorter figure. Despite being an alcoholic and a known drunkard, Haider remained impressively tall, and even though 50 years had passed, he didn't look drastically different. His face bore deep wrinkles, and he looked somewhat aged, but surprisingly, he wore the same style of robes as before. Perhaps he had donned them specially for today's gathering. Ash couldn't resist a tease. You finally look like a real priest. You're no longer the drunken priest you used to be. Should I say you've grown more respectable or something? That's because I'm now the bishop of the holy city, Haider replied with a proud grin, shrugging slightly as he looked at the two. A sigh escaped him. You two really haven't changed at all. A priest who only cares about food and wine, becoming a bishop. Frieren muttered, amused. Ha. Looks like I'm blessed by the goddess, unlike someone here who's probably managed to offend her. Haider chuckled smugly, looking far from the pious figure a bishop should be. Offended, huh? Ash mused aloud. What? Any clues? Did you actually do something disrespectful to the goddess? Haider asked, intrigued. Well, when I was young, I might have had a bit too much to drink back in the village and, held onto a statue while I vomited everywhere. Does that count? What do you mean, does it count? Of course, you'll be punished for that. Haider looked momentarily taken aback, despite his own easygoing relationship with alcohol. Even the usually silent dwarf, Eisen, couldn't help but sigh. The mystery we've wondered about for years finally has an answer. Unlike the two humans, Eisen hadn't changed much over the years. But Ash, glancing at him, couldn't resist asking, you've aged, too, haven't you? Really? Has Eisen changed at all? Frieren couldn't help but glance over curiously. With a hint of nostalgia, Eisen closed his eyes and replied, while my appearance may not have changed much, everything within, the body's functions, has aged. It's certainly not like before. Is that so? Frieren turned to Ash, perplexed. But he seemed stronger, doesn't he? Come to think of it, all of you have weakened, yet Ash somehow grew stronger. That's because. Ash began, but Himmel interrupted with a gentle smile, human constitutions vary widely. Is that right? Frieren tilted her head in confusion. Remember Azer? He was one of the strongest warriors among humans, wasn't he? Even after a dragon bit off part of his head, he still survived, Haider explained, smiling. A normal person could never handle that. So maybe Ashir has a particularly resilient body. Who knows, maybe he'll even live another 20 years. True, Eisen nodded. Even after being bitten by a snake whose venom could kill monsters, Azer survived through sheer willpower. He was once shot by a poisoned arrow strong enough to make a dragon faint, but he bounced right back. Other dwarves wouldn't be able to withstand that kind of damage at all. Exactly, Haider added, patting Eisen's helmet with a grin, then turned to Ash, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Ash, I'm starting to think your body might be as ridiculously resilient as Eisen's. Ash lowered his head, speaking vaguely, unsure of what to say in this moment. Because, compared to the somewhat oblivious Frieren, the others had clearly picked up on something. Yet, they showed no signs of asking about it or even hinting at what they'd realized. Were they just pretending not to notice, or were they worried that, even with their combined strength, their age might leave them too frail to confront him? No. That couldn't be it. Though he didn't fully understand their reasons, this was the one thing Ash felt certain about. After Himmel and Haider's explanations, Frieren, though still a little confused, eventually accepted their perspective. She knew her understanding of humans was nowhere near as deep as that of these two older men and, ultimately, chose not to dwell on it any longer. She never considered that they might be lying to her. After all, why lie about something so trivial in everyday life? And with that minor episode behind them, the group, carrying only light provisions, set out on this final adventure. They walked under the gentle morning sun, crossed winding rivers, climbed mountain ridges, and camped in serene forests. Each new day, as sunlight filtered through dense leaves casting a pattern of light and shadow, they continued their journey, accompanied by a gentle breeze. In this way, they traveled leisurely, and after about a week, they reached lake, nestled atop a mountain. At sunset, these old friends who had been reunited after so long gathered on the grassy banks, chatting as they waited for nightfall. "You know, Ash," Frieren said, suddenly recalling something as she turned to the boy who hadn't aged and smiled. "Didn't you make a wish all those years ago, wanting to watch shooting stars with a lovely, serious girl? And now, here we are." "Yeah, I suppose I did," Ash replied. 50 years, and still no luck," she teased. "I've been training all this time. The candidates who came my way were all a bit unusual. Honestly, compared to them, you seem much more normal." Only now did he remember the wish he'd made 50 years ago. Reflecting on it, he realized he had spent half a century in the same old monotony. It was a bitter thought, and he didn't even know how to express his frustration. Seeing his troubled expression, Frieren softened. She shook her head with a gentle smile and, together with Himmel, put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Watching this, Haider couldn't help but feel nostalgic. Smiling, he straightened his glasses and said, "Isn't this nice? If things don't work out this time, you've still got another 50 years to look for someone. And if you can't, well, we'll be here next time too, if we're still around." Himmel stroked his beard, adding, "There's no rush. Since we're seeing another shooting star, why don't we make another wish now?" "Forget it. It's pointless anyway. Wishing again now would only leave me feeling more empty," Ash replied. "Really? But I think this isn't so bad," Himmel mused as he gazed up at the sky, smiling. "It really takes me back. Being with all of you is like reliving the days when we traveled together." Frieren raised her head with a grin, boasting unreservedly, "Of all of us, I'm the most reliable one here." "You?" Himmel chuckled warmly. He chose not to mention her embarrassing past, when treasure chest traps would often catch her off guard. Instead, he watched as the first meteor streaked across the night sky and murmured thoughtfully, "Now that I think about it, you've always been part of my fondest memories. Isn't that a bit sad?" Ash said, shaking his head with a faint smile as he gave Himmel a gentle pat on his bald head. "Isn't this supposed to be a happy time?" "You really lack respect for your elders," Himmel sighed with a wry smile, though he didn't brush Ash's hand away. Instead, he lifted his gaze toward the sky and whispered, "Frieren, because of you, I get to experience this wonderful adventure again." Frieren glanced over curiously but remained silent. Himmel then lowered his voice further, leaning in to address the young man beside him. "And Ash? What is it? From now on, I'll be relying on you to look after Frieren and the humans. That's quite a lot to take on all of a sudden. I know you can handle it." "Why?" Ash asked, a bit surprised. "It's my intuition." Himmel smiled, leaving his answer at that. Their conversation was meant only for the two of them, with Haider, seated nearby, overhearing. Meanwhile, Frieren and the other companion were lost in the splendor of the night sky, captivated by its serene beauty, as if it offered them a glimpse into the mysteries of life itself. After fulfilling their 50-year-old promise, the group returned to the city, their laughter and joy marking a bittersweet end to their journey. But, on the very first night back in the city, Himmel quietly passed away in his sleep, his wish seemingly fulfilled, with nothing more to tether him to this world. He left peacefully, a gentle smile gracing his face. To honor the departed hero, the kingdom held a solemn funeral at the cathedral in the capital. Soldiers in full regalia formed the honor guard, while Haider personally presided over the ceremony. People from all corners of the city gathered, those who had been touched by Himmel's kindness coming to bid him farewell. The low, mournful tones of the funeral music echoed through the cathedral, filling it with an atmosphere of both reverence and sorrow. Throughout the crowd, soft sobs and deep sighs broke the silence, and every face reflected a sense of loss. Even Frieren, who once thought Ash had perished and had known that sorrow, now lowered her gaze, her expression one of quiet grief. In a voice barely above a whisper, she murmured words only she could hear, "Human lifespans are so fleeting." Had even elves come to change after all these years? Ash looked at Frieren but chose to remain silent. Instead, his gaze returned to Himmel's still, smiling form in the coffin, and he, too, echoed her sentiment. Yes, human lifespans are indeed short. As he stood there, watching his old friend rest eternally, Ash found himself understanding why Siri had long avoided deep connections with humans. When his eyes drifted to Haider, he felt a deep ache, knowing it might not be long before he'd attend his old friend's funeral, too. Perhaps, Ash thought, it would be best to leave once this farewell was over, and maybe never return. Chapter 65, Holding Hope, Believing in Reunion, Bad News. When Haider stepped down from the host's seat to let the local bishop take over, he stood beside Ash and overheard his quiet sigh. It was a sentiment that didn't sound like something a demon should say, but it made Haider smile. He offered his answer on behalf of his late childhood friend and closest companion. "Ash, you're mistaken. I think this span of life is just right, and I'm certain that Himmel's ending was a happy one. It would be nice if that were true." Ash nodded vaguely, not entirely convinced. Haider emphasized his tone. "It must be true, because in the end, we were all there with him, so he left without regrets. I know I would have no regrets if I were in his place. I'd rather not think about it. I don't want to attend 2 funerals in one day. Haha, I'm just teasing. After all, I'm different from you. The goddess still watches over me." The heavy, mournful funeral gradually came to a close, lightened by Haider's offhand jokes and his aged laughter, which, though out of place, gave a bittersweet warmth to the proceedings. After a night of rest in the capital, everyone gathered at the city gate the next morning, though now one friend short. A church carriage awaited Haider by the gate. Before stepping into the carriage, Haider turned back to the remaining 3, taking a long, final look, with a warm smile that was far gentler than his usual one. "Let me have a good look at you. This may be the last time we meet. Are you feeling unwell?" Frieren asked, worry visible in her eyes. But Haider only smiled and replied, "Must be retribution for years of drinking." That truly sounds like divine punishment. Just as Haider would often call him disgusting, Eisen's words toward Haider were equally cutting. Yet it was clear neither took offense, their barbs were simply part of their camaraderie. Haider just laughed, climbed into the carriage, and asked them to bring wine to his grave if they ever visited the holy city. Frieren felt puzzled by Haider's easy acceptance of death. When she pressed him, he gave only this answer. "We're the heroes who saved the world. After we're gone, we'll surely live the high life in heaven. That's why I fought alongside you all." Ending with that playful remark, Haider flashed them a contented smile, then shut his eyes as the carriage carried him away, leaving them all in silence. "Heaven," Ash muttered to himself, while Frieren laughed. "For someone like Haider, maybe. But you, a lazy wall-climbing hooligan who even vomited on the goddess's statue, forget it." "No, I never expected it." "Really? At least you're self-aware." "Of course." The goddess was the demon's sworn enemy, even the thought of him reaching heaven seemed absurd. He merely shrugged at the idea, which prompted Frieren to study him, worry shadowing her expression as if she feared she'd offended him. "I was only teasing. You haven't given up on yourself, have you?" "Why would I?" He chuckled, patting her head. "You're the one who should figure out what's next. How many times have I told you not to touch my head?" Frieren batted his hand away but, for a fleeting moment, held her suitcase a little tighter. Her usual calm gaze softened as she looked at the two of them. "As for me, I'll keep moving forward as before. What about you?" "I'll go home. There's nothing else keeping me here." Eisen's tone was as flat as ever, but it had been that way for so long that no one minded anymore. Yet Ash, recalling his one visit to Eisen's home, couldn't help but pull a wry face. "Honestly, you'd be better off becoming an adventurer to earn some money. Maybe then you could spruce up that cave a bit. Last time I was there, I thought I'd stumbled into an open-air tomb. At least there's no worry about being robbed." What's wrong with that? Because there's nothing worth stealing in the first place. Is that really a benefit? Forget it. These old bones can't handle that kind of life anymore, Eisen replied, stroking his absurdly long beard as he shook his head slowly. Besides, I'm used to it. I can fill my belly by hunting. What's wrong with a carefree life like this? You all really have no ambitions. In truth, as a member of the heroes' team, aside from Haider, everyone else was rather unremarkable. It made Ash, as a demon, feel that humans had been far too stingy in rewarding them. Thankfully, none of them seemed to care. Though Ash had tried to steer the conversation with Eisen, Frieren continued to watch him, waiting silently for his answer. It was a question he had no desire to answer, one he couldn't easily respond to. He scratched his head in frustration and sighed. I'm not really sure. Maybe I'll just wander around. I have to head south before I leave, and I need to visit an old friend on the way. Oh. Yeah. So, goodbye. Maybe we'll have the chance to meet again. They exchanged their farewells, and a quiet Eisen nodded. A faint smile mixed with a touch of barely perceptible sadness drifted between them, lingering in the air for only a moment before dissolving. Ash was the first of the remaining three to depart. Watching the figure she'd known for 1,000 years, so familiar it could not be more familiar, Frieren stood still, sensing, perhaps for the first time, the true feeling of farewell. A faint ripple stirred within her heart, a subtle sadness at the thought of the upcoming separation. She wasn't sure. But then she thought again, this was hardly a final goodbye. Surely, it was just the prelude to another reunion. After all, he always appeared when others thought him gone. With that belief, she quieted the emotions rising within her, holding on to the hope that they would meet again in the near future. Even though reason reminded her that, this time, there was no promise, and perhaps they truly wouldn't meet again. But meetings and partings were the rhythms of life, and she had grown used to it. This, she thought, was how it was meant to be. The thought that they might never meet again made her unconsciously tighten her grip on the suitcase as she stood there, letting the sudden gusts of wind tangle her beautiful silver hair. When Ash arrived once again in the long-lost southern region, where the kingdom of Tad lay, he found that the boy he once knew, Anderson, was now an elderly man with white hair. Yet, when Anderson saw Ash, his initial surprise quickly turned to joy, and he rushed over like an excited child. Despite having lost his parents and now living with a great-granddaughter old enough to help with the household chores, Anderson welcomed Ash as warmly as he had 59 years ago, even inviting all his relatives over to meet him. Though slightly uneasy, Ash accepted the invitation, and when he couldn't decline, he picked up Anderson's great-granddaughter, playing with her for a while. But he only stayed briefly, ultimately choosing to leave. Throughout his short visit, Anderson surprisingly didn't ask any questions about Ash's unchanging appearance. Did the old man lack curiosity, or was there another reason behind his silence? Ash couldn't be certain, his mind hadn't aged as gracefully as his unchanged face. It would be better if I didn't come here again. Satisfied that Anderson's family was well off and wouldn't need his help, Ash decided not to visit this place again. After all, the next time he returned, Anderson would no longer be here. With that thought, he took one last look at Anderson and his family, then lowered his gaze sorrowfully, disappearing from their sight before nightfall without staying the night. And then, just like that, about 18 years later. While eating in a city square, he overheard unexpected news from a nearby table where a traveling merchant was talking, fresh from a journey outside the city. The war has erupted again in the South. Hasn't the South always been at war? Or rather, wasn't it just the North that saw a pause during the Demon King's invasion? Haven't things been turbulent again since then? It's different this time. 3 southern nations have formed an alliance, and the kingdom of Ermis, the first to be struck, has already fallen. Even the kingdom of Tad may not hold out much longer. The merchant's conversation revealed that the southern countries, which had long been unstable, were now engulfed in a larger conflict. The kingdom of Tad, where Ash had once served as a general, had been forced to retreat, abandoning several towns and cities in the process, including the one he had helped establish years ago. He'd resolved long ago never to return to that place. But hearing that familiar name stirred a worry he couldn't ignore. After confirming the news, he immediately took flight, heading south without a second thought. Along the way, he saw countless refugees scattered on the roads below, and several cities had been reduced to ruins. The once vibrant town he had called a second home now lay in devastation. Countless homes had been engulfed by flames, leaving only charred remnants to bear witness to the disaster. Others stood as hollow frames barely clinging together. Some had crumbled completely, piles of rubble scattered across the ground like silent tombstones, marking the remnants of past prosperity and the haunting desolation that had now settled over this place. Chapter 66, After the Old Friend. ______. The town was filled with the grim sight of corpses scattered among ruined buildings. The invading forces must have been in a hurry, they hadn't even bothered to clean up the dead, and there was no sign of logistical support in the area. Not a single sign of life remained, only vultures circled, flying ominously above the city. No one's left. Did they escape? Or did they die outside? Ash stood in front of the only familiar building on the street, now burned to ashes. His expression turned gloomy as he took in the scene, the quiet devastation of a place he once knew. But with no one remaining, he naturally couldn't linger here. He took off, flying above the land to search among the scattered groups of refugees forced to abandon their homes, hoping to find some trace of familiar faces. Even if Anderson himself was probably no longer alive, his grandson, now around 30, might still be. The years might have changed him, but Ash figured he'd still be able to recognize him, probably. As he scanned the crowds, he couldn't find anyone he recognized, yet something else caught his attention. High above the refugees, he noticed a strange young girl gazing up at him with an expression of shock. This wasn't just the usual surprise at seeing someone flying. Her reaction held a deeper familiarity, a kind of recognition that struck him as strange. Curious, he descended to the ground, crouching down to look at her more closely. The child before him was dirty, dressed in a simple gray uniform that looked like something a magic apprentice might wear. Her purple hair and matching violet eyes were strikingly familiar, echoing the features of Anderson and his great-granddaughter. While he studied her, she held a familiar wooden box tightly in her hands. Her wide eyes filled with disbelief as she finally spoke, her voice uncertain. "Are you Master Ash? The name's right. You're Anderson's great-granddaughter. I remember your name being Marion. Wait, that doesn't seem right." He remembered Anderson's great-granddaughter had been around 10 years old last time, yet this girl couldn't be more than 7 or 8. It didn't make sense that she'd somehow aged backward. Which could only mean Marion is my mother. Really? Well, maybe it's better if I don't ask. The question lingered, but there was no need to press further. He simply looked at the child before him, who continued to gaze at him with an intense, silent stare, her expression filled with a mixture of distress and silent relief. The two looked at each other in silence. The girl appeared at a loss for words, while Ash himself wasn't sure what to do about her. She was the descendant of an old friend, standing alone amid the chaos. Ignoring her wasn't an option. But the idea of him taking care of a child, no matter how he thought about it, he couldn't see himself as a guardian. Still, judging by her frail appearance and the absence of any adults, it was clear she couldn't survive alone. He didn't need to ask what had become of her elders to understand the situation. After a long while, Ash finally reached out, placing his hand on the girl's head, and said hesitantly, "How about you come with me, at least for a while?" "Follow you?" "Yes. I can probably only provide food and clothing, but if that's all you need. Well, why don't you come with me for now? I'll see to it that you're taken care of until you're grown." "Why?" The girl's expression didn't light up, instead, she looked confused, almost troubled. It was as though, even in her current situation, being offered help wasn't something that brought her any comfort. Perhaps the loss of her family had struck her too deeply. Ash let out a quiet sigh, noting her sadness. "No matter what, I can't just stand by and watch the descendant of an old friend die by the roadside, can I?" "Is that so?" "That's right. And if it helps, you can think of me as your dad. After all, I did carry your mother around when she was little." The statement sounded strange, and the girl seemed at a loss for words. She only looked at him with a faintly puzzled expression, saying nothing. Ash felt he should say more, but seeing her in such a fragile state, he decided against it. He was conflicted about the whole situation and even wondered about who would take care of her in the long run, but for now. "Well, if you're not saying no, I'll take that as agreement. Just come along with me for now." He took her hand. The girl opened her mouth as though to object, but he didn't give her the chance. He took her along without waiting for a reply. It wasn't until they had left the devastated town behind and reached a nearby city that Ash suddenly remembered something. He turned back to the girl, who was still perched on his shoulders, looking tired and quiet. "Oh, right. What's your name?" "Fern." "Well then, Fern, just stick with me for now. I'll do my best to find someone dependable to take care of you." "Aren't you?" "I'd like to, but the situation doesn't allow it. You see, I'm, well, an evil magician." He paused for a moment, then smiled slightly, patting her head once more. "Evil magician?" Fern muttered, as if trying to understand what that meant. After all, he'd just taken her along, then complained about her pace, ultimately carrying her on his shoulders, and only now thought to ask her name. He didn't seem very considerate, she thought. This man didn't match the gentle magician her mother used to describe in her stories. Could he really be an evil magician? At that moment, Fern, sitting on his shoulders and shifting slightly to get comfortable, found herself pondering this thought as she looked down at him. Though, truthfully, she didn't fully understand what being evil even meant. In the city, Ash found an inn where they could rest. After buying some new clothes for Fern, he stood outside the bathroom, his arms crossed as he stared up at the ceiling, deep in thought about her future. Aura's not an option. Siri did adopt Flam, so maybe that's a possibility. Then there's Haider, Eisen, and Frieren, but Eisen's situation is far too complicated, and Frieren's location is still unknown. Haider. Is he even alive? Maybe I should check. He remembered attending Himmel's funeral over a decade ago, after which he chose to keep his distance from others. But now he was feeling torn. If he didn't reconnect soon, wouldn't that be too cold? He felt unsettled, wondering if missing another final farewell would eventually lead him to a regret he could never undo. However, his worries didn't lead to any answers. Instead, the sound of water from the bathroom gradually stopped, and Fern, wrapped in a misty layer of steam, emerged first. Noticing Ash's troubled expression, Fern seemed a bit embarrassed. She tilted her head slightly, hesitating. "Master Ash." "Ah, are you finished?" "Yes, thank you." Her hair still damp, Fern stood there, hands clasped between her thighs, bending slightly in a shy, reserved manner. Now that she's washed, she's surprisingly cute. She looked like a little beggar before, but I bet she'll grow into a beautiful girl one day, he thought. Casually, he grabbed a towel and pressed it to Fern's hair. He rubbed her hair roughly, drying it a bit, then blew a gentle, warm stream of air from his palm to finish drying it before leading her to the room she'd be staying in. "You'll sleep here tonight. I'm right next door. If you need anything, just call." "I understand. Thank you, Master Ash." "No need to be so formal." Fern still looked a bit awkward and timid, and he shook his head helplessly before retreating to his own room. Originally, he'd planned to spend the night pondering over where he could place Fern in the long term. But in the middle of the night, he heard muffled sobs coming from the next room. With a faint, wry smile, he threw off his blanket, floated out his window, and gently opened the window to her room. Once inside, he saw her curled up in a corner of the room, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, trembling as she cried. How long has this kid been on her own? What has she been through? He wondered. But instead of asking, he quietly moved closer. After a moment's hesitation, he crouched beside Fern and reached out to stroke her purple hair, which looked dull and brittle from malnutrition. The frightened girl flinched slightly, then glanced up at him. Recognizing him, she relaxed a bit but remained silent, burying her face back in her knees. As he continued to stroke her hair, her crying grew louder, as though his touch had unlocked a well of sorrow. Ash said nothing, choosing instead to hold her close. He understood that sometimes a warm embrace could be more comforting than words. Even though he wasn't sure if his hug was comforting, it was all he could offer at that moment. Yet, whether it was the wrong approach or not, he couldn't tell. In his arms, Fern's sobs grew more intense, her restrained tears now flowing freely. No matter how he tried to soothe her, it was of no use, his efforts only seemed to deepen her grief. A few annoyed tenants knocked on his door, muttering complaints, but they quickly backed off after a single glare from him. The crying continued until, exhausted, Fern finally drifted off to sleep in his arms. Kids today are hard to raise. Even more difficult than teaching Siri how to cook. Though it was only his first day of caring for her, Ash already felt overwhelmed. His clothes were damp from her tears, and he sighed for what felt like the 100th time that night. Yet even so, he didn't let her go. And at some point, her tiny hands had found their way to his shirt, clutching it tightly as she slept. Chapter 67, Searching for an Adoptive Parent, Siri's Daily Life. _________. To accommodate Fern's limited stamina, Ash chose a different approach. Even though humans could now use flying magic, it was an exhausting technique that demanded significant physical endurance. Even expert flyers like Frieren couldn't sustain flight for extended periods without feeling the toll on their bodies. Thus, to preserve secrecy and Fern's strength, Ash refrained from flying her the whole journey. By day, she traveled by carriage, and at night, after she fell asleep, he would quietly cast a spell that temporarily sealed her within a hardened, petrified state. In this form, she became an unbreakable stone that he could carry with ease. Under cover of night, Ash would then take to the sky, crossing mountains and rivers at a steady pace, until, after a month, they arrived at the northern magic city. Is the north of the continent really this close? It only took a month by carriage to get here. Fern, who was often shuffled between different carriages each time she woke up and barely ever had a full night's rest, stood at the edge of the bustling metropolis. She shivered slightly in the crisp air, blinking at the impressive cityscape before her. Her sleepy eyes were full of surprise. Having been asleep during most of the journey, she hadn't noticed anything odd. Ash answered casually, "This is only the northern kingdom, so it's relatively close to the kingdom of Esther in the south. You were almost in the central kingdoms before, so naturally, the distance wasn't too far." The kingdom of Esther. I heard of it from a merchant who passed through once. Oh. You heard of it? Yes. They said it's been thriving for the past 100 years, with the strength to rival the empire, and it's becoming known among the nations. Though she didn't fully understand what an empire was, Fern shared what she had overheard. Her innocent recounting of rumors made Ash smile, his expression filling with pride. Isn't it impressive? I don't really know. It sounds strong, though. That's right. A sense of accomplishment swelled within Ash. For years, he had poured his energy into a series of reforms, modernizing the kingdom of Esther with policies suited to its needs. While democracy wasn't feasible in their time, he had effectively centralized power and brought meaningful changes to the governing systems across the kingdom. His efforts alongside Aura had even led to the peaceful annexation of 2 neighboring territories. And that wasn't all. By learning ancient agricultural magic from a long-lost elven drunkard, Ash had trained a new generation of agricultural magicians, turning the kingdom of Esther into the first nation free from hunger. In time, he formed the Magic Knights, a formidable force that matched the empire's elite. Though Fern couldn't grasp the scope of his accomplishments, children throughout the southern regions knew of them, which made him eager to bask in her admiration. But instead of awe, she only looked at him blankly. What's wrong? Fern's lack of interest left him feeling strangely empty. He shook his head, brushing it off, and walked ahead. It's nothing. Let's go in first. Fern tilted her head, puzzled, but quickly caught up to him with a small trot. It wasn't long before they reached Ash's city residence, a simple home, far from the grand estates of the nobility. He disliked the idea of maintaining large, desolate places that felt like abandoned ruins without constant care. The residence was a modest yet comfortable building with only 3 rooms, though only one room was actually in use. I feel like, this place hasn't been lived in for a while, Fern observed, brushing her fingertips along the tea table in the living room and frowning at the dust gathered on her hand. Unfazed, Ash simply opened the door to his room. You can stay here tonight. I'll arrange for someone to clean it tomorrow. All right. Fern nodded and began curiously surveying the sparse room. Aside from a bed and quilt, there was little else to be seen. She couldn't help but ask, is this Master Ash's home? Let's call it that, Ash replied. Just, tentatively. I don't have any permanent address. I see. To Fern, this evil magician was surrounded by mysteries, so there was much she didn't understand. But she held back her questions and instead showed her sensibility, immediately heading into the room to clumsily hang the quilt to dry. You don't have to do that. Tomorrow. Actually, I'll just find someone to handle it later. It's okay. I'm free now. Suit yourself, then. I'm going out for a bit and should be back before nightfall. All right, take care on the road. Ash, unsure of how to interact with a child, scratched his head before heading out. As he walked away, Fern, well-behaved and with her head slightly lowered, watched him leave with an expressionless gaze. Once he was gone, Fern glanced around, rolled up her sleeves, and set about clumsily tending to the unfamiliar household tasks. Meanwhile, Ash made his way to the Magic Association, recalling that Siri happened to be in the city giving lectures to the new first-level magicians under her mentorship. He quietly began asking people around the association if any of them would be willing to adopt a child. After all, he thought it better for a human to raise Fern than for her to be left in the care of a demon like himself. He was even willing to provide lifelong support if someone took her in. But, as he suspected, none of the magicians seemed particularly interested in raising a child. By the afternoon, as the crowd thinned out, he approached Siri and asked directly, "Siri, don't you ever think of raising a child? It must get lonely always being on your own, right?" "What nonsense are you talking about, idiot?" Siri looked at him as if he were mad. "If I were to raise a human child, I'd probably end up being the one who dies. So it's completely out of the question. Why are you even asking if you already know the answer?" "Well, it doesn't hurt to try. Even if the chances are slim, maybe you'd take her on a whim. After all, didn't you adopt Flam before? This child seems to have some magical potential. Don't you even want to consider it? Flam was a one-time thing, a whim. I'm not planning to do it again." Siri declined outright, then sneered at him. "But it's so unlike you to show this much concern for an orphan. What are you talking about? I'm not as cold-hearted as you. If I see a child who might starve on the roadside, of course, I'll help them out." "Cold-hearted? Really? Is that what you think of me?" "Just a joke, don't overreact. Don't worry, I won't do anything drastic. But I'd say it's about time. Let's see how much progress you've made recently." As Ash displayed a wary expression, Siri's smile turned ominously sinister. What followed was hardly unexpected. Even though Ash was no longer the feared man of 1,000 years past, he once again found himself facing Siri's unreasonable, violent outburst in the Magic City. Of course, it wasn't simply a random attack. Over the years, she had wanted Ash to eventually take over her responsibilities and had purposely crafted situations that would earn him favors from her subordinates, making it easier for him to step into her role in the future. With this in mind, whenever Siri planned to renovate an area, she would often strike without warning, especially while Ash was mid-sentence. Of course, she might also attack even when he wasn't speaking. Thus, in the blink of an eye, dazzling lights filled the air, rubble flew, beams collapsed, and side halls crumbled in this branch of the Magic Association. This sort of scene unfolded roughly once every decade. The older magicians had long since learned to flee at the first sign of trouble, while the newer, slower ones relied on Ash to rescue them. After a round of Siri's merciless bombardment, the entire designated demolition site lay in ruins. Amidst the swirling dust, Ash was hunched under a destroyed section of wall, supporting it with his back, while a trembling young magician stood before him. Ash, his face streaked with blood, had shielded her completely, leaving her unharmed. However, when he clearly saw the young magician's face, he sighed in exasperation. "What is this, sense? Speaking of which, don't you have the strength to protect yourself?" "And no. My hands and feet are shaking." With long brown hair and a doll-like appearance, Sense looked younger than her years, giving off a Lolita vibe. Her actual age was a mystery, and she was known for her usual blank expression, but at this moment, fear was evident in her wide eyes. Even though Ash's warm blood occasionally dripped onto her face, making her pupils tremble, she remained frozen in place. Then, Siri's dissatisfied voice cut through the dust. "Sense, do you really consider yourself a first-level magician? Maybe because you used too much force and the kid felt your magic." Ash replied, exasperated. "But you felt it too, yet you managed not only to escape but also to protect others," Siri noted, casting a disdainful glance at the still trembling Sense. She scoffed, "You may have the title of first-level magician, but this is the best you can manage." With that, she swaggered off, leaving Sense crestfallen, her head hanging in defeat. Ash sighed, resigned to cleaning up after Siri's antics. With a loud crash, he pushed the destroyed wall away with one hand, wiped the blood from his face, and squatted beside Sense. Don't let it get to you. Though Siri may be harsh, she recognizes your abilities, otherwise, she wouldn't have allowed you to reach first-level magician. Really? Though she seemed unconvinced, Sense's gaze softened, unconsciously revealing a hint of admiration and longing as she looked at Ash. Chapter 68, Completely Contradictory Goals. _______. Noticing the silent longing in Sense's eyes as she sat on the ground, Ash was practically certain, though Siri's plan was straightforward, it had indeed succeeded. Yet, despite the clear respect directed toward him, he couldn't bring himself to feel pleased for some reason. Instead, he still felt like Siri was scheming against him somehow. But looking at the girl in front of him, who seemed on the verge of retreating into herself after being struck by Siri's harshness, he sighed, gently stroked her overlong hair, and told her solemnly. I have no reason to lie to you, right? And besides, you were frightened and almost got hurt. I think you should go up to her and ask for compensation. Is that so? Sense looked at him blankly, her face filled with doubt, even as she hesitated. She couldn't help but ask, if that's the case, why don't you ask for compensation, Master Ash? Because even if I asked, she definitely wouldn't give it to me. Ah. Then why should I? I'm different. If it's you, she'd probably give it to you. Probably. Sense stared at him, her mind struggling to fully grasp his words. But Ash didn't answer. He simply patted her head, stood up, and started to walk out of the ruins. Seeing him leave, Sense instinctively reached out, trying to stop him. Wait. Master Ash, are you leaving already? But what about your injuries? I just remembered, I haven't fed the animals back at home yet. Go ahead and clean up the place as best as you can. A professional construction team will arrive soon anyway. Ash suddenly recalled that he'd rushed out and hadn't left any dinner money for Fern. So, with a simple goodbye, he left, already preoccupied with thoughts on how to rebuild the damaged section of the branch, and how to prevent future expansions as much as possible. The girl, of uncertain age, remained sitting there, gazing at his back as he disappeared. At his temporary residence in the city. When Ash came back, he immediately noticed the little girl busily working with a damp cloth, wiping down the room. The bedding, which had been left lying around, was now freshly washed and hung out to dry in the yard. The cold northern climate had turned her small hands red, yet she continued her chores diligently, performing tasks beyond her responsibilities without complaint. It's like watching an adopted child, nervous about being abandoned, forcing herself to work hard, putting on a cheerful face, trying to prove her value. Seeing Fern's efforts, Ash couldn't help but sigh. And in truth, his assessment wasn't far off. Although she couldn't clearly hear his mumbling, Fern looked up, having heard the sound, and asked instinctively. Welcome back, Master Ash. What happened to you? Did you run into robbers? Finally taking a good look at him, she noticed that he was covered in dust, with blood on his face as if someone had struck him with a hammer. She immediately rushed over in panic. It's just that I ran into a bully. Thinking about Siri's smug face, he was a bit exasperated but tried to brush it off. However, seeing Fern's worried face, he couldn't help but add, I'm used to it. Really, there's no need to worry about it. A bully. Getting used to it. Fern picked up on his words, but without further comment, she calmly began wiping the blood from his forehead, saying softly, it's really okay, this seems to happen often. Fern's concern finally burst out as he shouted, this isn't a small issue, is it? We have to go find the guards right away. No, we should go to the church first. Oh, by the way, I forgot to leave you some money for dinner. Sorry about that, I'll make up for it next time. Just come to me if you run short, Ash replied, pulling out 2 gold coins from his pocket with a hint of guilt. Compared to Fern's rising panic, Ash, accustomed to battles and injuries, seemed completely unfazed. But his indifferent attitude, combined with his thoughtfulness, stirred up something warm and indescribable in her heart, like a mix of gratitude and frustration. Trying to hold back her tears, she pushed him forward and urged. Now is not the time to worry about things like that. You're still bleeding, hurry to the church. All right, I'll go. Just don't. No buts. Please, just hurry. With Fern's firm but frantic pushing, Ash finally found himself inside the church, where they saw to his wounds. That night, when Ash settled down to rest, he noticed his quilt was filled with a faint but comforting scent of sunshine, reminding him of something long lost. And nearby, tucked in the corner, was the faint outline of Fern's head resting close. On that first night, Fern seemed a little shy and avoided his gaze, her nerves keeping her from looking directly at him. Yet despite her unease, whenever Ash took her hand, she felt a gentle warmth fill her heart and an odd sense of calm that washed away her worries. The young girl, after spending most of her day doing housework, had grown exhausted, and gradually fell asleep with her head leaning against his shoulder. Perhaps that quiet night had brought a subtle shift between them, creating a small, new closeness. Ash wasn't entirely sure, but he stroked Fern's hair gently and closed his eyes, letting sleep take him away. As time passed, Fern's temporary stay in this magical city stretched on until more than half a year had flown by. During these months, Ash's routine became one of early starts and late returns. He took charge of the reconstruction work at the Magic Association branch and often found himself spending time at Siri's library. Now and then, he would even head out of town to spar with Rivali, known widely as the bloody god of war. After all, a warrior like Rivali, left idle for too long, would eventually find someone else to fight, and that could mean serious trouble. Just grab something to eat from the street vendors. This country is quite safe, so as long as you don't leave the city, you don't need to worry, he said, increasing her allowance a bit. Even though he had hired a maid to help look after her, Fern had naturally taken on much of the household work. For a girl just 6 years old, she showed a surprising sense of responsibility, often handling things that even Ash neglected or overlooked. One particular morning, as the soft, warm light of dawn filtered through her window, Fern rubbed her eyes and stretched, feeling the gentle sunlight rouse her from sleep. The soft bed made Fern sleep soundly. It was incredibly comfortable, as Ash had taken the time to find a mattress on the street that felt just like the one in her old home. She could now fall asleep peacefully without needing Ash to hold her hand, though that left her feeling a bit lonely. Still, she didn't want to trouble Ash, so she kept her feelings to herself. When she stepped out of her room, she didn't see any familiar faces around. It was still early, so early, in fact, that even the maid who stayed nearby hadn't arrived yet. Naturally, Ash wasn't there either. Lord Ash is really busy with work, Fern murmured to herself, reaching out and touching his bed. The lingering coldness of the sheets told her he'd been gone for some time, which made her feel a little disappointed. But with a quick pat on her own cheeks, she forced herself to cheer up, then washed her face, ate the breakfast the maid had prepared for her, and hurried off to school. Since her parents had found a magic tutor for her when she was younger, she had a good foundation in magic, so it was only natural for her to be studying at the city's magic academy now. Recently, she had even made 2 new friends at school, though, oddly enough, they quarreled often. But the teacher said that being able to argue like that is also a sign of a strong bond. Master Ash and I have never argued. Does that mean we don't have a good relationship? Fern wondered to herself. The sun was just starting to rise, and the air on the street was chilly in the early morning. Fern hugged her hands close to her face to warm them as she pondered. But soon, she stopped thinking about it, as she noticed the 2 familiar figures approaching. The girl with orange hair and twin ponytails, and the silver-haired girl with blue eyes, were bickering as usual, bringing a smile to Fern's face. "Good morning, Connie, Rabini," she greeted them warmly. "Oh, Fern. Hurry and help me pin her down. This girl keeps yanking my hair. I swear, if she doesn't stop, I'm going to kill her," shouted Connie, the orange-haired girl with twin ponytails, her expression dramatic as she wriggled around in frustration. But Rabini, the silver-haired girl, simply pushed her off, giving a calm smile as she greeted Fern. "Good morning, Fern. It's a beautiful day today, isn't it?" "Yes, perfect weather for airing quilts," Fern replied without much thought. "Quilts?" Rabini glanced up at the clear sky, pondering for a moment. "You're right, actually, but wouldn't a day like this be better for just having fun outside?" Connie added, seeming puzzled. Fern, not giving it much thought, responded, "Well, Master Ash really likes the smell of quilts that have been dried in the sun." "Master Ash?" Connie tilted her head. "Come to think of it, I've heard you mention him before. He's family, right? Why do you call him Master, though?" "This." Fern hesitated, a bit distressed as she fumbled for an answer. Without missing a beat, Rabini kicked Connie sharply, sending her stumbling forward. Don't pry into other people's family matters. Isn't that one of the school rules? Did you forget so quickly? Ugh. You jerk. Of course I remember. But there was no need to kick me like that. Connie grumbled as she brushed herself off, looking both flustered and annoyed. Realizing she might have crossed a line, her attitude softened a bit, but she kept mumbling complaints as she dusted herself off. Fern quickly knelt down to help Connie up, and seeing Connie's grateful expression, she couldn't help but think about her own relationship with Ash. How should she describe it? Technically, she'd been adopted by him, but if she didn't call him master, what else could she call him? Great-grandfather? Grandpa? Uncle? But judging from his appearance, those titles clearly didn't fit. Even calling him brother felt odd. The question troubled Fern until she finally arrived at the academy, and with the start of lessons, she managed to set it aside. As her teacher demonstrated magic at the front of the class, she watched intently. I'll work hard, so that when I grow up, no one will be able to bully Master Ash. Every time she thought of his bruised and bloodied appearance, her heart tightened. Fern whispered her resolve to herself, secretly vowing to put in more effort. Because, what she wanted most was to be someone who could protect Ash. Rather than worrying about their exact relationship, this was her biggest dream right now. When Ash finally returned home after a busy day, it was already late at night, the sky completely dark. As he tiptoed into the courtyard, he noticed a warm light coming from the living room. When he stepped inside, he saw an oil lamp flickering softly and Fern, curled up over a desk, fast asleep with an open book on the basics of magic beside her. Was she waiting up for me, or did she just fall asleep while studying? Ash wondered, feeling unsure. But as he gently picked her up, he couldn't help but sigh softly. This can't go on, you know. While Fern often worried about how she might repay the kindness he'd shown her, Ash was frequently caught up thinking about who might be the best person to raise her. It wasn't that he lacked compassion, on the contrary, he felt this way precisely because he cared. Considering everything, and knowing that this wasn't the first night he'd come home to find her asleep waiting for him, he was increasingly certain it would be better for her to grow up with someone else, someone better suited to care for her. Because as time passed, Ash had come to realize that, beyond just providing for her immediate needs, food, clothing, shelter, there were deeper responsibilities, offering her emotional support, stability, even a future she could rely on. Though he felt a certain attachment to her after living together for a while, he knew that finding her a true family, rather than being the one to raise her indefinitely, might be kinder in the long run. This was advice he'd once received from Siri, a reminder rooted in his own past. Moreover, he simply didn't have the time to be present in the way she needed. Hiring a maid to care for her seemed like it would only make her feel like a child left behind. Because, when a child grows up with their caretaker always absent, don't they just become left behind? Ash knew that from the perspective of her well-being, both physical and mental, this was far from ideal. As the last descendant of a dear friend, he felt it was his duty to ensure Fern had a warm, loving home rather than a cold, empty room where she felt isolated. Being a demon who had grown up alone, Ash could relate, if only a little, to how isolating such a life could feel. After all, if he looked at the harsh environment in which many demons were raised, it was no wonder they became hardened over time. Even humans, if raised without connection in a similar way, would likely end up no different. Ash believed deeply that a nurturing environment, with guidance and companionship, could make all the difference. At least, that's what he had come to believe. Chapter 69, Parallel Lines of Understanding, the First Gift. ______. The importance of the environment one grows up in cannot be overstated. Take demons, for example. Aura serves as a fitting illustration. Someone like Schlacht must have grown up in a good environment, which is why he became one of the rare demons who genuinely cares about others, even willing to sacrifice himself for the greater good, despite the rampant individualism in demon society. Of course, it's hard to say exactly what shaped Schlacht into such a demon. He just seemed to possess that nature. Meanwhile, Ash had to raise the child by himself. Not only did he lack the time and energy, but he also had to worry about Fern being negatively influenced by someone like him. Unfortunately, he didn't have any normal friends in his circle, and most of his close ones were gone. If he asked Aura for help, there was a real risk it could end tragically. At least now he was entirely anxious about Aura's involvement. Most nobles in this kingdom were basically controlled by Aura. If they were entrusted to his care, their fates would be sealed should he lose control. So, after much contemplation, and over half a year of worry and searching, Ash still hadn't found a suitable guardian for Fern in this magical city. He finally decided to turn to Haider for help. He had been concerned that Haider might not be alive anymore, but an investigation revealed that Haider was retired and, surprisingly, alive and well. As a highly respected bishop of the Holy City and a former hero of salvation, Haider had a much stronger reputation, and the people he associated with were more serious and reliable. Naturally, Ash immediately dismissed the option of having Haider take on the role himself. After all, it was hard to say when that wine-drinking, meat-loving priest might die, and Ash wasn't exactly confident in his ability to raise a child. If only Himmel were still alive, he'd be the ideal candidate in both character and temperament. Sadly, the goddess hadn't been particularly fond of him, and he was the first to die among their team. Though our time together was brief and regrettable, I'll definitely help you watch over her. Now, sleep peacefully. Gently, he placed Fern onto the bed, covered her with a blanket, and softly stroked her hair, which was slowly regaining its healthy sheen. He then silently resolved to do everything he could, even if it took 1 or 2 years, to have Haider find a suitable home for the child. The next morning, warm sunlight spilled onto his face, rousing Fern from a deep sleep. Under the gentle nudge of the morning sun, she rarely allowed herself a moment of idleness, stretching and wiggling on the bed before finally getting up, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Master Ash must be away again today, she muttered, habitually patting her face as she sat on the edge of the bed, a trace of loneliness in her voice. But then, no, I'm here today. Master Ash. Startled, she turned toward the voice, only to see Ash, who was almost always absent, sitting at her desk, flipping through a magic book she couldn't understand at all. She quickly stood up, tidied her messy hair and pajamas, and bowed her head respectfully. Good morning, Master Ash. Is there something you need today? Don't be so tense, try to act more naturally. The girl's nervous demeanor reminded him once again that this wasn't the attitude one should see in a typical family setting. Ordinarily, he should be patiently working to soothe the inner pain of this traumatized child and slowly build trust, making her feel less restrained. But whether it was because he'd become numb after living so long, or perhaps because he worried that forming too close a bond would be unwise, he just couldn't bring himself to do it. He had tried everything he could think of, yet after more than half a year, things were still the same. He didn't know what exactly he should do to make her feel closer to him. Looking at the girl sitting so stiffly, he finally made up his mind, put down his book, and crouched in front of her. Fern, do you have class today? Yes, there's nothing special scheduled. Is something the matter? Ash was always very busy, sometimes vanishing for 3 or 4 days or even a week. It was the first time he'd asked her a question like this, showing interest in her schooling, which made Fern look a bit surprised. It's nothing, really. I just thought I'd like to visit an old friend. Would you like to come with me? Me? Fern blinked, slightly confused, but agreed without much thought. Of course. Then maybe find a good moment to say goodbye to your friends. Goodbye. Why? Well, he lives pretty far away, in the holy capital of the Central Kingdoms. The answer came almost automatically, leaving Fern feeling curious as she tilted her head in confusion. But isn't the Central Continent actually very close? Actually, I plan to stay there for a year or 2. After all, it's been a long time since we last saw each other. That's all, Ash explained vaguely, making up an excuse. He felt he needed to wait until he found the right way to tell her the real reason. That way, they could at least enjoy the journey in the spirit of a trip, making it easier and more enjoyable for both of them. Hearing such a long time frame, Fern's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't protest and instead nodded. I understand. I'll say goodbye today. Good. I'll come with you, and we'll speak with your teacher as well. Thank you, Master Ash. There's no need. Being treated so formally by the child always made him feel a bit awkward, but he understood her behavior and said nothing more. In truth, Fern felt a little disappointed and reluctant to part with her friends, but she was too mature for her age to voice it. It's worth mentioning that Ash believed the main reason for their lingering distance was that, from the day they'd met, Fern had never once refused any of his requests, not even a tentative suggestion, and had never made a single request herself. So, together they went to school, managed her temporary leave of absence without delay, and Fern bid farewell to her friends. He exchanged only a few words with the second-level magician teacher to formally arrange her suspension of classes. Of course, for the sake of Fern's future, Ash was also thinking about finding a magic academy for her to attend once they arrived in the Holy City. Inside the carriage, Fern sat quietly on the floor, unlike typical children who might have been excited about leaving the city. As they passed through a bustling district on their way out, she gazed out the window with a quiet curiosity. Having always lived on a peaceful street and traveled along a secluded path to school, this was her first time stepping into the lively, chaotic heart of the city in a long while. The bustling streets outside were lined with an array of stalls displaying brightly colored meats and vegetables, creating a vivid and vibrant marketplace. Vendors called out energetically, and their voices overlapped, adding excitement and life to the beginning of their journey. Yet, while Fern was intrigued, the crowd and noise seemed a bit overwhelming to her, and she unconsciously shifted closer to Ash for comfort. However, as the carriage moved on, her eyes were caught by a vendor selling silver leaf bookmarks along the roadside, and she couldn't help but stare at them. When Ash noticed her gaze, he thought for a moment, then called for the carriage to stop. Looking at her, he asked, "Is there something you like?" "No, I was just curious." She shook her head slightly, almost as if apologizing for her curiosity. "It's fine. If something catches your eye, you should get it as a keepsake," Ash replied casually. Hearing this, Fern hesitated for a moment before murmuring softly, "But, isn't it wasteful to spend money like that?" "Is that really something a child should be worrying about?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. "Sorry." She lowered her head, clearly feeling as if she'd made a mistake. Seeing her reaction, Ash found himself both amused and troubled. He sighed, "I'm not blaming you. If there's something you like, you should pick it. But if you don't pick something, I'll feel bad," he added, hoping to reassure her. "Then, just one will be fine," Fern said hesitantly, clutching her collar with both hands. She finally followed him out of the carriage, still looking a bit nervous. In front of the stall, she cast her gaze over the items, but despite the variety, she ultimately selected the one that looked the simplest and least expensive. "This one. Are you sure?" "I think this one would suit you better," Ash said, smiling helplessly as he reached out for the silver leaf bookmark she had been glancing at earlier. Her reaction was almost like a child who had been caught doing something wrong, standing there with an awkward expression. Seeing this, Ash gently placed the bookmark into her hand and reached out to pat her head. "All right, don't overthink it. Isn't this pretty? And if it's something you like, then it's perfectly fine." "Thank you. I'll definitely keep it as a treasure." Unexpectedly, her words of gratitude, full of warmth, seemed like sunshine breaking through her previous awkwardness and unease, replacing them with a quiet sense of happiness. Holding the bookmark tightly in her hand, she nodded firmly. In truth, part of her restraint came from the way Ash was always busy, often using work as an excuse. From a young age, she'd come to realize that making money wasn't easy, though she hadn't completely understood why. As for Ash, he'd never gone into details, and Fern, being an understanding child, never pressed for them either. If she had asked, he'd have likely made up an excuse on the spot, resulting in an unspoken understanding between them, a kind of mutual respect that created a silent distance. Back in the carriage, Ash resumed his book while Fern, now seated nearby, admired her new silver leaf bookmark with quiet satisfaction. It was clear she had taken a genuine liking to it. This caught Ash's attention. He chuckled and gave Fern a gentle pat on the head, causing her to smile shyly. Though their understandings were like two parallel lines, they somehow managed to get along, if just barely. After crossing mountains and rivers, they finally arrived safely near the Holy City. However, instead of entering the city, they wandered around the nearby forest, searching for a cabin rumored to be hidden not too deep within. "Master Ash, are you sure you know where your friend is?" Carrying her small suitcase, Fern trudged through the forest for what felt like half an hour. Her small body began to tremble with fatigue, and glancing around, she couldn't help but murmur, "It feels like I've been here before." "Did you figure it out? Did Master Ash do this on purpose?" "Of course. For a magician, having a strong body is important." Unable to find the way, Ash made up an excuse to save face. Fern sighed, lowering her head. This is the first time I've heard that. What's with that attitude? Your teacher must be subpar if he doesn't know this. But the book says otherwise. And Mr. Lies is a second-class magician, almost as skilled as a first-class mage. It's kind of rude for you to say that. Fern looked a bit embarrassed but gently suggested, in the wilderness, it might be fine, but if we're in the city, you might want to avoid saying such things. People could misunderstand and think, you're jealous. Why would I be jealous of a second-class magician? Now that I think about it, you're a magician too. What rank are you? You're probably exhausted. No more exercise. Let's just fly up and find our way. Ash quickly changed the subject, avoiding the question entirely. Being Siri's disciple, he had never felt the need to take a ranking, and suddenly faced with the question, he decided it was pointless and might come across as showing off. Without further ado, he shot into the sky. Fern shook her head and sighed, so no ranking. Could it be that Master Ash is just lacking magical talent? Reflecting on her words, she silently prayed that she hadn't gone too far. Was he perhaps insecure about it? Fern felt a tinge of regret for speaking carelessly, hoping she hadn't hurt his feelings. As to why she assumed he was weak, it was because she sensed that Ash's magical presence seemed faint. However, in reality, she was just an apprentice, unable to discern Ash's deliberately crude concealment of his magic. Since Ash had never boasted about his abilities, she hadn't inquired further. After all, flaunting magical prowess to a child would feel a bit hollow, right? Ash never anticipated that his self-esteem would be handled with such care by a child who still had so much to learn. Once he found their destination from the air, he promptly landed, scooped Fern up, and flew towards the cabin nestled in the woods. As they approached, the lonely cottage emitted a steady stream of black smoke from its chimney, and the tantalizing aroma of stewed beef and potatoes wafted toward them. It was evident that someone was cooking inside. That old drunkard must be feasting on meat and wine again. Seems we've arrived just in time, Ash muttered to himself with a grin. Happily taking Fern's small hand, he led her up the steps, ready to enjoy a long-overdue meal. Fern, however, looked a bit hesitant. After all, they had come from afar and hadn't even brought any gifts, yet they were already thinking of eating for free. Was this truly acceptable? Chapter 70 Haider, Be a Decent Person. ________. Haider's retirement home was a typical Western-style cottage. Though it was considered small, it was actually fairly spacious, with at least 3 or 4 rooms on each floor. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it had a simple charm, with ivy creeping up the walls and a small attic tucked on the second floor. An independent well stood by the entrance, along with a modest vegetable garden. It was autumn, the season of harvest, and before Ash even knocked on the door, he couldn't resist glancing back. Without waiting for Fern to say anything, he picked a tomato, wiped it clean, and took a bite. Fern watched with a worried expression. Master Ash, it's really not proper to pick and eat things without permission. The owner of this place could be upset. It's fine, he won't mind. Though I'd prefer this tomato cooked, like in scrambled eggs with tomatoes. Then don't pick it in the first place. Fern seemed distressed by his casual attitude. What are you saying, Fern? My friend grows these veggies, it's only natural I'd want to taste first. That's kind of the whole point, right? I'm sorry, I don't understand at all. It's all right. You'll get it when you're older. Really? Fern nodded uncertainly. But as she looked at their suitcases, a thought crossed her mind, and she spoke up, but Master Ash, rather than thinking about things like that, we didn't bring any gifts or anything. Is it really okay to visit like this? A gift? Is something wrong? Fern looked up, puzzled, while Ash played with the tomato, muttering, this is odd. I don't remember teaching you about all these strange, complicated etiquettes. This is basic manners, Fern insisted, unconsciously emphasizing her words. Even a 7-year-old like me understands that. No, I think it's normal not to understand such things at your age. Ash was both amused and exasperated by this little child with such an adult-like demeanor. With a sigh, he reached out and ruffled her hair, then handed her the half-eaten tomato. Ah! What is this? Fern instinctively took it, about to question him, but before she could get an answer, Ash had already strolled up to the cottage and knocked confidently on the door. Haider. I'm here to hang out. Open up already. I'm coming. Soon, footsteps sounded from within, followed by an elderly voice. The door creaked open, and there stood an older man, walking slowly with a cane. When he saw Ash, his eyes widened, and a nostalgic smile spread across his face. Well, I thought I must have misheard. Never expected you to actually come here on your own. Yeah, something like that. Haha, didn't you just say you were here to hang out? Haider chuckled, shaking his head in amusement. Whatever Ash's real reason for visiting, he didn't seem to mind. Well, come on in. Then I'll help myself. When have you ever been polite with me? That's true. Ash chuckled but didn't enter the house immediately. Instead, he turned around and called out to the little girl who was still lingering by the vegetable garden, glaring at the tomato in her hand with a hint of annoyance. Fern, stop fussing over the tomato and come in. Yes. I'm coming. Fern snapped out of her daze, quickly running over. She stopped in front of Haider and bowed politely. Nice to meet you, Master Haider. I've heard so much about you from Master Ash. Oh, what a polite child. Not like you at all, Haider chuckled, squatting down to look at Frieren with a warm smile. However, when he noticed the half-eaten tomato in her hand, he couldn't resist casting a sidelong glance at Ash and shaking his head. I take it she learned that bit of impoliteness from you. Ah, well. Fern looked at the tomato, then up at Ash, clearly embarrassed. She quickly bowed her head to Haider and apologized, her voice soft with guilt. Sorry. I ate the tomato without permission. Eh? Oh, it's all right. I was only joking. Feel free to pick and eat whatever you like. Make yourself at home. Haider laughed, waving his hands dismissively. Then he shot Ash a playful look. Let me tell you, this kid is nothing like you. She's polite and well-behaved. Actually, I'd like to clarify something. What is it? That tomato. I was the one who picked it. I didn't think it tasted very good, so I gave it to Fern. Ash hesitated, realizing it wasn't right to let the child take the blame, and finally confessed. Haider's smile froze. After a long silence, he dropped his kindly demeanor and scolded him sharply. Could you be decent for once? You actually let a child take the blame for you. No, this is your own misunderstanding, isn't it? Ash protested. The child admitted it herself. Haider retorted, exasperated. Ash blinked, a little taken aback. Oh, so it seems. This is definitely your fault. No, this is completely unfair. I didn't ask her to do that, much less train her to cover for me. Ash spread his hands in innocence, but Haider wasn't buying it. What normal child would willingly take the blame like that? Maybe she was influenced by my good character, Ash replied, feigning sincerity, and grew up to be such a good kid. Impossible. This is. Haider's voice suddenly faltered as he was overtaken by a fit of coughing. Cough. Cough, cough. All right, calm down. Why get so worked up? Just take it easy. You, cough, you realize, cough, cough. This is entirely, your doing. Haider continued his complaint between coughs, pounding his chest in an attempt to catch his breath. His eyes were full of frustration, while Ash remained casually innocent, patting Haider on the back to ensure he didn't choke. Fern watched this exchange with a puzzled expression, wondering if these two had a good or a bad relationship. Once they were inside and seated at the simple wooden dining table, Haider was still regaining his composure. Haider rested his hand on his forehead for a long moment before shaking his head and sighing. I've been a bishop for so many years, maintaining a dignified, calm image, and yet you've come along and ruined it all. Actually, maybe you were just pretending to be good all along. Ash replied with a smirk. Haider gave him a disapproving look. Is that what you say to an old man? You may think otherwise, but with age comes this kind of change. Not everyone is like you. Oh, is that so? Haider opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, his gaze shifting to Fern sitting next to Ash. Whatever he wanted to say seemed to vanish as he grew silent. What's wrong? Ash asked, sensing the shift. Fern smiled and shook his head, then turned back to Fern with a curious glint in his eye. No, it's nothing. But. Fern, is it? Such a charming little girl. It almost seems like a shame that she has to follow Ash around. That's not true at all. Fern's face grew stern as she defended Ash, refuting the remark with unexpected resolve. Anne, please don't say bad things about Master Ash. Right on, Fern. Ash nodded approvingly from the side, clearly encouraging her. Let's team up against this wine-drinking, meat-loving priest. However, Fern, looking distressed by the teasing, turned back with a sigh. Master Ash, you're also not helping. Master Haider is the bishop here, after all. It doesn't feel right to say these things. Ha ha. What an interesting child. Haider laughed heartily, as if he were genuinely amused by his favorite young visitor. He leaned on the table and observed her thoughtfully. Fern, what is your relationship with this troublemaker? Are you his daughter? Though, judging by how you address him, that doesn't quite seem to fit. Eh? My relationship with Master Ash. Fern looked troubled for a moment, clearly caught off guard. She had, indeed, pondered this question on her own before, yet had no clear answer. Sensing her unease, Ash reached over, placing a hand gently on her head. Actually, it wouldn't be too far off to think of her as my great-granddaughter or something along those lines. Great-granddaughter? Since when were you married? Haider asked, his surprise evident. No, actually, I was thinking of her more as your granddaughter. My granddaughter. Haider looked stunned. When the words finally sank in, he took up his cane with renewed vigor, his expression determined. Ash, however, was quick to react, pulling Fern onto his lap, effectively blocking any attempt Haider might have made to reach him. Now, is that any way for an elder to behave? Using a child as a shield? Shield? That's an awfully biased view. I'm simply showing my warmth in her presence. Ash said it lightly, patting Fern's head with a gentle smile. Isn't that right, Fern? Yes. I suppose so, she replied, clearly embarrassed by being used as an innocent buffer between the two. Nevertheless, she obediently stayed seated on his lap, looking both flustered and a bit resigned. Haider observed the exchange thoughtfully for a long moment before finally speaking, his expression shifting to something more serious. Ash, could we speak alone for a moment, as old friends? What's on your mind? Something important. Haider adjusted his frameless glasses carefully, his voice low. Well, that's rare. Ash nodded casually, looking down at the girl on his lap. Haider, why don't you head outside and play for a while? Okay. With surprising understanding, Fern nodded, slipping down from his lap. She made her way to the door and stepped out, even thoughtfully closing it behind her to give them privacy. Chapter 71, Holding Hostage, Escape from Responsibility. After the door closed and the room fell silent once more, Haider didn't speak immediately. Instead, he added a piece of firewood to the fireplace beside him, casting a thoughtful glance at Ash, who was quietly observing the room. Though I doubt it, that child, she hasn't been mistreated by you, has she? Haider asked with an unexpected hint of suspicion. Huh? What are you suddenly talking about? Ash looked at him, clearly confused. No matter what, if you were mistreating a child, I'd have every right to get angry and throw you out. Do you really think I'm that kind of person? Haider chuckled and shook his head. I was only joking. I don't believe you do that. He then grew more serious, his expression puzzled. Honestly, you don't strike me as the type to just take in a child. And besides, it seems she's had a difficult past, hasn't she? You can tell. After all, I've lived a long life and have some experience reading people. Working in the church, you often encounter children who carry similar burdens. Is that so? Ash nodded thoughtfully, briefly wondering whether to share more about Fern's story. After some consideration, he realized there was no need for secrecy or any elaborate explanation. He decided to tell him directly. Have you heard about the war that broke out in the south recently? Of course. I heard the fighting was fierce, with many refugees fleeing to our area and even farther north. Well, Fern is from the south, and she's the descendant of an old friend of mine. Her entire family, they all perished in the war. Fern's family once lived well enough. They weren't nobles, but they were comfortable, with enough food and means to ensure the children were educated, even hiring a magician to tutor them. Her family had only mentioned, in passing, that her great-great-grandfather once knew a mysterious magician. When Ash handed her a family heirloom, it was the first time she saw the face of this figure who, for reasons unknown, was connected to her family's past. But as for what exactly happened to her family, whether they encountered rebel soldiers or bandits, Ash didn't elaborate. Those details remained unspoken, likely because he couldn't ask her to relive such horrors, nor did she seem to know the specifics. Her family's town lay high on the snowy peaks, a place of strategic value due to its expansive view and defensive advantages. Because of its position, it had often been a contested stronghold. Usually, if they lost control of the area, the townsfolk would evacuate immediately. But this time, defeat came too quickly, and no warning reached the people in time. The lack of evacuation led to a tragic series of events. As Ash recounted the story, a quiet settled over the room, punctuated only by the crackling of the firewood. After a long silence, Haider finally rose, took out 2 cups from the cupboard, poured wine into each, and downed both in one go. Exhaling deeply as if trying to release the heavy weight in his chest, he sighed. I understand the basics of her situation now. But you didn't bring her here expecting me to raise her, did you? My health isn't what it used to be. Ash gave a wry smile. How about you start by quitting drinking? What are you talking about? If quitting were that easy, I wouldn't have been given the title of wine-drinking priest by everyone now, would I? Haider, now an older man, shook his head repeatedly, looking a little annoyed at Ash's suggestion. Why make things difficult for an old man at this point? Besides, wine is the best of all medicines. Isn't it because of drinking that I'm still here today? Is it really okay for a bishop to talk nonsense like this? Ash muttered, feeling the urge to roll his eyes at such a strange justification. It's fine. I wouldn't say that to anyone who might actually believe it. But let's get back to the main point. Haider poured himself another glass and smiled wryly. For you and Frieren, 2 so-called heartless and unfeeling people, to suddenly come visit me, I assumed something was wrong. It seems related to that child, right? Wait a minute, you're suddenly making a personal attack here. Is it untrue? Even though Himmel, Eisen, and I live in different towns, we've kept in touch through letters. Only the 2 of you have made just one visit in 50 years, with no messages in between. All right. The matter that requires your help is indeed related to Fern. Is that really true? Ash was momentarily surprised by the idea that these people might actually value friendships beyond appearances. But he simply pretended not to have heard it and continued speaking seriously. Haider, however, gave an annoyed smack of his lips, looking completely unashamed. TSK. It's so shameless of you to ignore my complaints and then boldly make demands. Why is an elder like you arguing over such trivial matters with someone younger than yourself? Ash spread his hands, as if trying to ease the mood. In terms of age, aren't you actually older than me? Haider quirked a brow. Who really knows? Ash replied, then paused, his expression shifting to one of slight sadness. But honestly, my body may still be holding up, but it can't withstand the test of time forever. Though, I doubt you'd believe that. Really? Haider raised an eyebrow, a hint of surprise flashing in his eyes before Ash broke into a laugh a moment later. Just kidding. Really? I get it. Just stay there and wait for me, Haider responded after a long silence, standing up and disappearing into the house. What's wrong? The cane isn't effective enough. I'm getting something iron, so it'll hurt more when I hit you. Wait, are you serious? Seeing Haider actually bring out a heavy mace from his room, Ash was stunned and instinctively dashed out of the room. Surprisingly, Haider, who had seemed to need his crutch earlier, was now wielding the mace and walking briskly after Ash, as if he were determined to beat him into the ground then and there. However, when Ash ran outside and instinctively picked up the little girl, who had been watering the vegetable garden, holding her on his forearm, Haider had no choice but to halt. He quickly hid the mace behind his back, clearly not wanting the child to see such a dangerous item. What? Fern, who was suddenly lifted and placed on Ash's arm, looked baffled as she glanced between the 2 men rushing out of the door. Despite her confusion, when she noticed the sweat on Haider's brow, she felt concerned for the old man who had suddenly started walking with surprising speed. "Lord Haider, it looked like you were in a hurry just now. Is something serious happening? Are you okay?" Ash quickly smiled, making up a reason. "We were just racing to see who could catch Fern first." But Fern looked bewildered. These two, were they really capable of playing such childish games? Haider could probably guess what the child was thinking, but now, faced with her innocent gaze, he could only nod with a stiff smile. Not wanting to leave a bad impression on this sensible child, he chuckled awkwardly. Ha, ha ha. It's rare to have an old friend visit, so I couldn't help reminiscing about my youth. Is that so? I suppose it's a good thing to be so lively, Fern replied, not doubting him at all. However, feeling a bit uncomfortable from being held, she squirmed slightly and looked up at Ash in confusion. "Master Ash. Now that you've won, can you let me go?" No, look at his shoulders, they're shaking. He must be unwilling to give in. I have to make him even more unwilling. Ha. I don't quite understand, but aren't you two friends? Why act like this? It's exactly because we're friends that I want to add insult to injury. Is that so? I feel like that makes a strange sort of sense. Thinking of her friends, Connie and Rabini, who were always bickering with each other, Fern nodded in agreement without realizing it. Seeing this, Haider couldn't help but start to worry, was this guy leading Fern down a strange path? Once they finished their antics, they returned to the house. At Ash's encouragement, Fern shyly enjoyed Haider's beef stew with potatoes. After a long journey and trek through the forest, she was exhausted and soon fell asleep early in the guest room. In the quiet of the living room, Haider sat with a hidden look of exasperation, watching Ash shamelessly drink his treasured wine and nag him into preparing more braised meat. If it had been anyone else, Haider would have long since kicked them out. But with Ash, he felt helpless, unable to do anything. Recalling Fern's obvious attachment to Ash during their brief time together, he tapped his fingers on the table meaningfully and spoke up. "Now, I want to talk about something serious." "I'm listening." "No, you're the first person to drink, eat, and chatter on in front of me like this since I became a bishop. It's an honor. I wasn't exactly complimenting you." "Ah, never mind." Haider sighed, though a familiar smile softened his face. Shaking his head, he continued, "You know, don't you? The bond between you and Fern, it doesn't feel like that of a simple foster parent and child. I feel the same way, which is why I came here. I was hoping you could help me find someone reliable to take care of him." "Someone reliable? Can't you do it yourself?" "Honestly, I might not have much time left, so I'm hoping you'll take care of Fern for me. Or could you bear to let her end up alone on the streets?" Haider frowned at Ash's words, falling silent for a moment. Then he spoke in a reproachful tone. "Are you really asking for a beating?" "It was just a joke, don't get too worked up." Ash waved his hands with a light smile. "In truth, I just feel I'm not suited to taking care of Fern." "Are you trying to evade responsibility? I didn't expect you to pass on your duties to others so easily." "I have my reasons." "Are you about to claim that you're dying again?" Haider felt his patience wearing thin, the urge to truly scold Ash bubbling up. But this time, Ash set down his braised meat, his demeanor suddenly serious. "No, I mean it. I simply don't think I'm the right person to care for her. You've seen it yourself, the way Fern and I interact." Haider pondered, then spoke slowly. "From what I can tell, the child seems to be holding something back. Sometimes, she gets close to you, but other times, she keeps an unnecessarily polite distance." "How long have you known each other?" "With the journey included, close to a year now, I'd say." "Really?" Haider removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. "Is it because she's deeply hurt, or because you're, well, irresponsible?" "The problem is with me." "What exactly is it?" "To be honest, I'm extremely busy, and I can't properly look after her. Most of the time, she's on her own, with only a maid occasionally checking in. That's why I'm asking you to help find someone suitable. The kid might be hurt by this. But it's a solution that benefits us both." "Benefits you both?" "I see." Haider didn't press further or ask why this arrangement was supposedly good for both of them. He could guess why Ash felt this way. It reminded him of the past, back when their adventure had ended and everyone had urged Frieren to consider taking on an apprentice, someone to keep her company on her endless journey. But Frieren had only replied, "It's a waste of time. No matter how much you teach, they're gone in the blink of an eye." Haider understood Ash's hesitation through that memory, so the following day, he started reaching out to contacts in the Holy City, hoping to find a suitable candidate. In the days that followed, various people began visiting the cabin in the woods. They would come, spend time, and leave. But no matter who they were, Fern remained unsatisfied, gradually realizing why Ash had brought her here in the first place. Yet, she didn't openly acknowledge it. She simply sent each visitor away, even as she grew increasingly aware of the reality she couldn't escape. Despite her efforts to avoid the truth, she was finally forced to face it. She had to accept that she was no longer needed. Chapter 72, Someone Else's Child. Underscore. Although both Ash and Haider were doing their best to keep Fern from noticing their true intentions, they continued to bring in people who specialized in child care, under the guise of inviting guests to play. Each time, they would subtly ask Fern how she felt about the guests and, in turn, gauge how the guests felt about her. They thought they had concealed their purpose well, but they underestimated the sensitivity of Fern, a former homeless child who had grown up learning to read between the lines. Or perhaps, more tellingly, it was the way those visitors looked at her that gave her the sense they weren't just here as friends of Ash. The turning point came one day when Ash and Haider went together to the Holy City. Fern, who was tidying up the room Ash had been using, noticed something unusual. The drawer was half open. "Did Master Ash forget to close the drawer?" she muttered. This particular drawer had always been securely locked, never touched in front of her. Now, seeing it partially open stirred an unsettling curiosity, and she couldn't help but glance inside. At first, she only intended to close it, but something caught her eye, a document with a familiar name, one of the recent guests. Unable to resist, she gently took out the file. Inside, she found extensive information about each visitor who had come by, personal traits, family background, financial standing, and, most importantly, their attitudes toward children. "Is this what I think it is? No, there must be some mistake," Fern whispered, her voice wavering as she tried to reject what she was seeing. Yet, with undeniable evidence laid bare, the truth she had long ignored finally broke through her defenses. The world around her seemed to lose its color and sound, leaving only her rapid, shallow breathing and the relentless beat of her heart. Her mind went blank, her pupils dilated, and she was left staring as the papers slipped from her trembling hands, scattering across the floor, just like the fragments of her heart at that moment. Ah. No. I need to clean this up. If I leave these documents scattered, Master Ash will be angry, but no, he's never been angry with me, not once. What is happening? Fern dropped to the floor, scrambling to gather the papers. Yet her vision was blurred, and despite her efforts to hold herself together, tears spilled down her cheeks without restraint. This is strange. Why can't I stop crying? I can't see. What should I do? Master Ash will be back soon. No matter how hard she wiped at her tears, they continued to flow. She tried to stifle the sobs rising in her throat, but the more she tried, the stronger they became, forcing themselves out against her will. It felt as if an invisible hand was gripping her chest tightly, squeezing with a pressure so intense she could hardly breathe. A sharp, wrenching pain struck her, forcing her to knees. She instinctively clutched her chest with both hands, as if that might ease the ache. Her face, usually calm and expressionless, was now distorted with despair, and finally, this mature but still young child was overwhelmed by the wave of emotions she'd been holding back. She covered her face, trying to silence her sobs, desperate to hide any sounds Ahe made. But her emotions refused to be contained, the quiet wails seeped between her fingers, filling the empty room with her heartbreak. Meanwhile, Ash had been dragging Haider through yet another circuit around the Holy City in search of a suitable candidate. After what felt like the nth round of interviews, Haider could no longer hide his growing frustration and exasperation, feeling increasingly doubtful that they would ever find the right person for this task. It wasn't just that Ash's requirements were demanding, Fern had no desire to leave Ash at all. Why can't he see that the child doesn't want to leave him at all? Haider thought, feeling helpless about the current situation. After spending some time observing, however, he understood he couldn't blame Ash entirely. Ash genuinely was busy with various matters, and Fern's personality made things complicated. Fern was too introverted and kept her feelings hidden. He was overly considerate, maintaining a distance no child should have. It would confuse anyone. The two of them were completely unclear about each other's true feelings, yet Haider, an old man watching from the sidelines, could see it all clearly. Caught in this unspoken tug-of-war, he decided to give Fern a chance. Quietly, he used a spare key to unlock Ash's drawer before going out. Today, he didn't spend much time wandering around the holy city with Ash. He quickly excused himself, saying he felt unwell and didn't want to burden the old man. Though Ash wanted to meet more people, he worried Haider genuinely wasn't feeling well, so he compromised and returned home with him. But just as they pushed open the half-open door, Ash was taken aback to hear the muffled sobbing of a child coming from the living room. What happened? Did you fall, or? He trailed off, frowning. No, that's not it. Fern hadn't cried since the night they first met. Remembering this, he instinctively reached for his sword and rushed into the room. However, the scene he anticipated wasn't there. Instead, he found Fern sitting on the ground, covering her face with both hands as if trying to hide all her pain and sadness. Her small body was still trembling. Papers lay scattered across the floor, and the drawer beside her was wide open. Did I forget to lock it? Ash was momentarily confused, glancing at Haider for guidance. But Haider only gave a faint smile, turned, and walked out, pretending not to see anything. He closed the door behind him. Ash hesitated, looking back at Fern on the floor. Then, he squatted down beside her, gently stroking her hair, trying to comfort her. What's wrong, Fern? How should I put this? To be honest, he had no idea what to say and found himself suddenly at a loss for words. Fern's small body jolted at his touch, but, realizing he was there, she began wiping her tears with one hand while clutching the hem of his clothes with the other. She looked up, her eyes full of helplessness and even fear, and apologized to him through broken sobs. I'm sorry. I didn't do well. It's all my fault. I'm sorry, I was wrong, please forgive me. Her voice was trembling, choked with quiet desperation. Seeing her like this sent a wave of panic through him. No, why are you apologizing? You haven't done anything wrong, there, please don't cry, he said, flustered. Look, I'll get you whatever you want to eat, okay? No, that's not it. I don't want to be someone else's child. Fern's words came out strained, as if each one took all her strength. She gave up wiping away her tears, her small hands clutching his clothes even tighter. Chapter 73, I should not have contacted humans in the beginning. ______. The young girl clung tightly to the hem of Ash's clothes, her fingertips turning white from the pressure, as if this hold was her last lifeline. Her previous words, combined with this desperate grip, seemed to silently convey, please don't leave me. I'll change, I promise. Ash looked down at her pale, slender fingers, sensing her silent plea, yet not fully understanding why she was apologizing. All he could do was stare at those small hands, his heart twisting in conflict. The air around them felt as if it had stilled, time moving at an unusually slow pace. Gradually, his eyes softened, shifting from confusion to a deep, tender warmth. A powerful, inexplicable force tugged at his heart, compelling him to reach out. He gently stroked Fern's soft hair, his other hand carefully wiping away the tears staining her cheeks. Speaking in the calmest, warmest tone he could muster, he said, I understand your feelings. I truly do. I'd like to agree, but it wouldn't be responsible for either of us. This is a serious decision for us both, so before I hand you over to a new family, let's talk things through, okay? Talk. Fern's voice wavered, broken by her sobs, but her expression shifted as she grasped his words. And as soon as she understood, her head shook vigorously, her tone trembling yet firm, no. I don't want to talk. Listen, Fern, I don't want it. Absolutely not, no. For Fern, who always carried herself like a little adult, this sudden, stubborn outburst was entirely out of character. But Ash quickly recognized that words were failing here. It was as though she were that person who usually stayed calm and rational, bottling up her feelings for far too long, and now that emotional floodgate had burst. Those who keep their feelings under tight control daily can often react explosively once they've reached their breaking point. He knew now that unless he agreed to her request, his words alone would mean nothing. When someone is in this state, negotiation is futile. At times like this, there's only two outcomes: either you succeed in reassuring them, or you fail utterly. But he didn't want to deceive her, nor did he want to face the consequences of a promise he might not keep. He simply wanted to avoid negotiations that could lead to further heartbreak for Fern. If he couldn't fulfill his promise, he feared the child would come to resent him in the future. So, when he saw her tearful face, her fragile hands clinging desperately to him, he chose a different approach. He simply reached out and pulled her into a gentle embrace. Holding her close, he let her trembling form rest against his chest, lightly patting her back without saying a word. He hoped this quiet action could provide some solace, just like on the night they had first met. And so, in this silent embrace, time seemed to lose its meaning. Gradually, her sobbing subsided, leaving only the soft rhythm of their breathing and heartbeats. Though Fern's tears had stopped, her small hands remained clasped tightly around Ash's waist, as if she feared that letting go would mean losing the warmth and security she'd found in his arms. Ash did not let go of her hand. Instead, he continued to hold the young girl gently, embracing her with such care that it felt as though any added pressure might break her fragile frame. Outside the room, Haider hadn't gone far. Instead, he lingered just beyond the window, discreetly observing the exchange between Ash and Fern from a distance. At that moment, even Haider felt that everything around him seemed to fade into a monochrome world, as if the only color left was in the quiet, pure bond shared between them. But he murmured softly, "Ash can't possibly accept this so easily, right?" Haider knew Ash well, much like he understood Fern's situation. While Ash hadn't explicitly revealed his true identity, Haider could sense it. Ash wasn't human, at least, not in the traditional sense. No human could defy the passage of time as he did, with a body that showed no sign of aging and, if anything, continued to grow stronger. For an immortal being to embrace the responsibility of caring for a human child, that would be incredibly difficult. This was why Haider couldn't entirely fault Ash's hesitation. Choosing to face short-term sorrow rather than risking long-term grief made sense, but that child genuinely wants to stay by your side, Ash. He's so sensible, too sensible, really, it's heartbreaking, Haider sighed, withdrawing his gaze from the window. If he were 10 years younger, or if Fern hadn't met Ash, Haider thought he might have still considered adopting the child himself, even if it felt utterly unwise. But as things stood, with someone like Ash in the picture, there was no space for him to step in. Because, in truth, his age simply didn't allow it. He was over a century old. At his age, Haider worried about whether he'd wake up from each night's sleep. He feared the thought of his body decaying in bed if he passed unnoticed. As grim as it sounded, this was the reality he faced as an elderly person living alone. So, even if Ash might one day walk away from his responsibilities, Haider knew he had to find someone to look after Fern. Otherwise, how would this child survive alone? Originally, he had intended not to meddle too much. But watching Fern tugged at his heart, and he couldn't help but step in, even if only slightly, and push things along in the hope of securing the girl's future. Finally, after a long wait, Fern cried herself to sleep. Ash gently lifted the exhausted child, carrying her to bed. Haider slipped quietly back into the room. Noticing that Fern still hadn't let go of Ash's hand, even in sleep, Ash glanced toward the open drawer across the room. He cast a questioning look at Haider, who approached silently, even foregoing his cane to avoid making a sound. In a hushed voice, Ash said, "Haider, you're the one who opened that drawer, weren't you? Are you suspecting your friend now?" Haider replied, feigning surprise. "Did you forget to lock it yourself?" There was even a trace of mock indignation on his old face. But Ash only looked at him with a cool, unwavering gaze. "Stop pretending, I know you too well." Haider heaved a long sigh, clasping his hands behind his back and shaking his head. "Ah, I never expected that. At the twilight of my years, my own kin and friends would turn against me." Ash's urge to punch Haider was almost overwhelming, yet he held back. His hand brushed over Fern's hair as she slept soundly, her head resting on her knees, tears in her eyes. Ash let out a long, weary sigh, as though trying to release all his pent-up emotions into the air. Only then did he manage to calm himself. If she'd simply forgotten to lock it, the child would never have opened it. It must have been opened by someone else, and that's how the name was revealed. You really do know Fern well, Haider commented. Whether I like it or not, I've known her for over a year. I suppose I understand her, Ash replied. Really? Really? Haider nodded with a mischievous smile. Seeing his attitude, Ash couldn't help but want to throw something at him. You got me into this mess for no reason, and now you act like this. Oops, my bad, haha, Haider laughed, clearly unfazed. He had already made his plan clear and, now satisfied, he smiled to himself, assured of his goal. With that, he turned and left the room, closing the door behind him. What's gotten into him all of a sudden? Ash stared at the closed door for a moment, his mind clouded, before he lowered his head in frustration. Looking down at the little girl lying on his lap, he absently stroked her hair, letting out another long sigh. Taking care of a child is more troublesome than I thought. I shouldn't have gotten involved with humans in the first place. But by now, it was too late to regret it. He had even started forgetting that he'd once been human. He had spent far longer as a demon than he ever had as a man. The next day, when Fern woke, she found Ash lying beside her. After a closer look, she realized she was in his room. The memories of the previous night came flooding back, making her nose tingle and her chest tighten as she struggled to hold back her emotions. She carefully gathered the clothes she'd worn the night before, then quietly got up. She went out to the yard to fetch water from the well, as she usually did every morning. In the open yard, without a fence, the gentle morning light brushed against her skin, bringing a soft, delicate warmth. Birds chirped in the trees, as if nature itself were embracing her in a quiet hug. The peace of the scene didn't soothe her entirely, though, just thinking about what happened the night before left Fern feeling downcast. Ash hadn't agreed to her request. It felt as though everything had already been fated, and the thought of having to bring up the topic again later filled her with dread. When the weight of the wooden bucket handle dug into her fingers, nearly overflowing, she clenched her teeth, determined to press on, swaying unsteadily as she walked. She wanted to prepare water for Ash's morning routine, just as she always did, despite the ache. But it wasn't only Fern who felt burdened, Ash did too. He had woken up the moment she had slipped out of the room. The thought of having to discuss the matter again made his stomach ache. Until now, he hadn't stopped to wonder why he was so conflicted over simply helping care for a child, even if it was only temporary. But when he saw, through the gap in the window, the small figure of the girl struggling with the heavy bucket, water splashing onto her feet and skirt, he couldn't help but sigh. Straightening his clothes, he walked out of the room to meet her. Chapter 74, Confession. The old man is scheming against me. _________. Fern, staggering toward the house and gritting her teeth to endure the discomfort in her fingertips, heard footsteps approaching. She instinctively looked up and noticed Ash, but there was an unfamiliarity about his expression that made Fern quickly lower her head, avoiding eye contact. Yet, despite everything, the polite child softly greeted him with a voice still hoarse from last night's crying. "Good morning, Master Ash." "Morning, but I'll take this." Ash sighed as he took the bucket from Fern. However, before he'd taken 2 steps, Fern's voice came from behind again. Master Ash. What is it? I'm really sorry about yesterday." Fern lowered his head so far it was nearly a full bow, her body almost at a 90-degree angle. This display was more respectful than Ash felt necessary, almost painfully so. "It's fine. It's normal, after all, you're still a child." "Thank you, Is there something else?" Ash turned, looking at Fern, who glanced up with a visibly anxious expression before carefully asking, "Did I do something wrong?" "No, it's my fault." "What does that mean?" "You're unusually inquisitive today." Setting down the bucket, Ash took a seat on the wooden steps, observing the child who stood there looking somewhat at a loss. Ash lowered his gaze and sighed softly. "As I said at the beginning, there's nothing wrong with you, and no reason to apologize. It's completely my fault." "No, that's not true. I think Master Ash is a very good person." "Oh. Really? Be honest." "There are, some strange things, but, no. I only want Master Ash. I don't want anyone else." "Absolutely not." Clutching the hem of her skirt tightly with both hands, Fern raised her voice, pouring all her emotion into her words. She squeezed her eyes shut as though afraid of seeing something that might shatter her hopes. But in reality, Ash simply sat there on the steps, leaning his elbows on his knees and resting his chin on his hands with an amused sigh. What kind of speech is that? If you were 7 years old. No, wait, aren't you 7.5 now? If you were 8 or 9, I might be moved hearing this. Yes. I'll definitely tell you. Even if it's 8 or 9 years from now, I'll absolutely tell you. Why did he have to wait until she was 8 or 9 years older to be moved? Fern was a bit confused, but she placed a hand on her chest and promised him with utmost seriousness. Such a solemn yet innocent vow made Ash chuckle and shake his head. You're still young, so maybe you don't fully understand, but what you just said is almost like a confession. Confession. Yes, it means expressing the feelings in your heart, love, or affection. So I'm just expressing my feelings toward Master Ash. Fern tilted her head in confusion, thinking it over before, with a hint of nervousness, continuing, Master Ash, do you actually dislike children? Because they're annoying? Or, am I being too difficult? No, that's not it. This is on me. Let's not talk about this anymore. If someone hears, they'll think I'm some kind of outrageous pervert. What was meant to be a serious explanation had veered into strange territory, leaving Ash momentarily at a loss. Realizing he was dealing with a genuinely innocent child, he rubbed his forehead, unable to look straight ahead. But despite his response, Fern still felt unsettled. Though Ash hadn't wanted her to worry, she couldn't help but say, Master Ash, if there's something you don't like about me, I'll really try hard to change it. No, you're wonderful just as you are. There's nothing I dislike about you. I like you, too. But, that's exactly why I can't stay with you like this. Why? Oh, how should I put this? Looking at the girl, who for the first time seemed a little confrontational, Ash rubbed his throbbing temple and sighed. Think about it, I'm busy, right? So. Fern's gaze was firm, unyielding. So, I can't take good care of you. If there was someone better. I don't want anyone other than Master Ash. Fern interrupted him instantly, making his words stop abruptly. I expected you'd say that. But why? Why do you insist on staying with me? Because if it weren't for Master Ash, I might have died on the roadside. It was Master Ash who gave me hot food, a clean bed, he gave me a home. When I was scared, you hugged me tightly. In the middle of the night when I was frightened, you held my hand gently. Even when you were injured, the first thing you thought of was whether I was hungry. So, I like Master Ash the most. By the end of this confession, which could almost be called hoarse, Fern was out of breath. Her chest was heaving with the effort, and she struggled to steady her breathing. Ash looked at her, dumbstruck, as complex emotions churned within him. He hesitated, wanting to speak but unsure of what to say. Her words had shaken him. He hadn't anticipated that her attachment to him ran this deep, though he couldn't deny that he understood. So, is this my fault? Yeah, it's clearly my fault. But I also have my reasons. Letting her go is the best solution for both of us. Why don't kids ever understand adult problems? No, I can't shift the blame here, Fern really doesn't know any better. To her, I'm like a parent. And to a child, losing their parent feels like losing their whole world. He could understand that. In the end, he found himself unable to say anything. Instead, he simply patted the step beside him, motioning for her to come closer. She approached cautiously and sat beside him, her gaze both hopeful and unsure. Ash stroked her hair and sighed softly, feeling as though he was yielding to something he couldn't escape. For now, let's set this matter aside. Why not give up? He glanced at Haider, who was peeking from a distance, and quickly came up with an idea. By the way, have you wondered why I get along with Haider? Why? Well, actually, Haider and I are about the same age. You're joking, right? Believe it or not, I'm even older. Fern's face was full of disbelief, her confusion evident. Seeing her reaction, Ash repeated the same reasons he had once given Frieren and others, reasons he knew could ease her worry without hurting her too deeply. Compared to any other explanation, this seemed to be the gentlest way to ease the blow for Fern. Though he wasn't entirely sure whether claiming he'd age out and leave her was any kinder than just vanishing due to other reasons, this seemed the least painful route. He was just beginning to think this plan might work, that maybe, just maybe, he could gently guide her to accept a more suitable family, when Haider unexpectedly stepped out from his hiding place. The old man, seemingly oblivious to what Ash was really thinking, wore a warm smile as he held an ancient book in his hands. If it's just a matter of lifespan, then there's no need to worry. What do you mean by that? This is the spellbook of Evasai, a sage from the mythical era. It contains the lost magic of resurrection and immortality. As Haider spoke, his expression remained serious, almost absurdly so. No, that kind of magic doesn't exist, right? You know who my master is. Even the great magicians of the mythical era didn't know all the magic, and this is a spellbook that hasn't been fully deciphered yet. I feel like you're lying to me. Please, just believe me for once. Besides, if it works, I'd like to live a little longer, too. Isn't this a win-win situation? Haider ignored Ash's doubt and handed the book to him with a smile, his face full of confidence. Fern, who had been feeling cold to her very bones, her eyes empty and tears threatening to spill, saw hope rekindle in her heart as she listened to their exchange. A small, bright smile broke across her face, and she hugged Ash's waist from the side, her face lighting up as if she'd been brought back to life herself. That's wonderful. Master Ash. You can live for a long, long time. This way, we can be together forever. Yes. Looking at her innocent and sweet smile, feeling her small arms hugging him tightly and sensing her body trembling slightly with relief, Ash found himself unable to extinguish this small glimmer of hope. After all, he couldn't bring himself to shatter the fragile hope of the child who'd just been pulled from despair. He couldn't bear to let her fall into an even darker place and face fresh waves of torment. Did this old guy really know what he was doing? Am I actually falling for this? He tried to force a smile, but inwardly he wanted nothing more than to hit the old man. As he stroked Fern's hair, he shot a glare at Haider and spoke through gritted teeth, trying to sound cheerful. To celebrate, let's break out your best wine today, shall we? You won't refuse, right? Ah, of course. Let's drink to our heart's content today. The anticipated smack to Haider's face didn't happen. Instead, he laughed with deep wrinkles on his face and took it upon himself to go to his room and fetch the prized wine. This left Ash feeling like he'd punched air. This guy. He really doesn't make any sense. Did he seriously scheme against a friend he's known for years just for the sake of a kid he'd only known for a short time? Did I make a mistake in choosing my friends? And honestly, no matter how you looked at it, this could only be considered a temporary compromise. From a long-term perspective, it was hardly rational. Reason told him to reveal the truth, but his heart couldn't bear to cause any more pain. So, he simply held his child close, thinking about how to finally end this whole dilemma. Well, forget it. I'll just take things one step at a time. If worst comes to worst, I'll take care of her into her old age myself. Holding Fern close at a 45-degree angle, he looked up at the sky and let out a long, resigned sigh, as though he'd finally accepted his fate. Chapter 75, Recording Fallen's Change, Visiting Elv. ____________. After being schemed against by Haider, Ash reluctantly accepted his fate. That night, after Fern smiled for the first time and fell asleep happily, he sat down and drank, venting his frustration. But contrary to his expectations, Haider, the notorious drunkard who'd spent his life indulging, just kept pouring the wine for Ash without drinking any himself. What's this? Are you reluctant to drink? Planning to take all this as an apology? Ash slammed his glass down on the table, glaring at the old man who merely chuckled in response. How could that be? I'd really love to drink, but... Haider, who had initially thought about having a grand drink with his friend as a kind of farewell celebration, now merely licked his lips, swallowed, and shook his head firmly. At my age, drinking too much might just bring me to my grave a bit sooner. You're over 100 years old, and now you're worried about that. Even if you kicked the bucket now, it wouldn't exactly be what anyone would call a short life. Ash rolled his eyes, feeling as if Haider was making up yet another excuse. Haider couldn't help but smile bitterly. Actually, I just decided a moment ago to quit drinking altogether. Are you serious? Despite all the warnings you ignored in the past. You even told me that it would be better to kill you than to make you quit drinking. You said it didn't matter if you were killed by dungeon monsters as long as you had a drink the day before. That was back then. Now, maybe I'm just feeling my age. Haider picked up a wine glass, took a deep breath, and sighed deeply. Yes. I lied to you. I really do owe you an apology. So. You're punishing yourself by quitting drinking. Somehow, I doubt you'd do it for that. Of course not. Still the same old wine-drinking, meat-eating priest, I see. Ash couldn't resist muttering, frustrated at how Haider wouldn't pay even such a small price without some resistance. But Haider ignored his remark, his gaze drifting to Fern's room door nearby as he spoke more softly. Maybe it's just that I'm older and my heart softened, or maybe I've always wanted a child of my own and am afraid of being alone after retirement. She's only been here for half a year, but that gentle, pitiful Fern is almost like a granddaughter to me. Do you really want to be my father? Don't interrupt when I'm saying something serious, Haider said, though he smiled at Ash's remark. Then he glanced back toward Fern's room with a slightly guilty look, confessing, I know that this decision hasn't been exactly fair to you. So I'll do my best to live as long as possible and help you take care of her in the meantime. But will it really make a difference if you quit drinking now? Who knows? But if it means I might live long enough to see her become independent, I'd be satisfied. It'd mean less burden on you, too. And whenever the time comes for us to say goodbye, it'll be easier for you to accept, won't it? You've been a bishop for so long that your lying skills have definitely improved, Ash muttered, clicking his tongue and shaking his head. We've been together for too long for me to just abandon that child completely. Oh, by the way, I have a gift for you. Haider smoothly avoided addressing Ash's comment, smiling as he pulled a small magic tool from his pocket and handed it to him. This is. I used a magic tool that can record sound. I recorded the child's confession. How about that? It's something worth remembering, right? Haider said, smiling. Ash was silent for a moment, resisting the temptation before he finally gave in. He nodded and tucked the pocket watch-sized magic tool into his jacket. Though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being manipulated, he knew that if he listened to it often enough, it would become nearly impossible to tell Fern he wanted to part ways. But if Fern listened to it herself when she grew up, Ash couldn't help but imagine how amusing that scene would be. Thinking about that future made him wish time would move faster, and he reluctantly went along with Haider's plan. After deciding to settle down, Ash would sometimes travel north, but for the most part, he remained here. The invisible barrier between him and Fern gradually faded after the two of them talked things out, and she grew even closer to him than before. But, Master Ash, I think excessive drinking is unhealthy. Master Haider has already quit drinking, you should follow his example. One morning, Ash was drinking and reading when Fern marched over, looking slightly annoyed. She snatched the drink from him, her pink cheeks puffed up in irritation. Come on now, it's one of the few pleasures an old man has. What am I supposed to do if you take it away from me? Besides, someone once told me that wine is the best medicine of all. Drinking a little isn't so bad, right? Ash shot a meaningful look at Haider, who had once made this very argument, forcing Haider to nod in agreement. Fern looked genuinely surprised. Is that so? Then, maybe just a little is okay. Lord Haider, I hope you can stay healthy forever. The young girl expressed herself so openly that Haider felt both embarrassed and deeply touched, while Ash, in the meantime, managed to reclaim his drink. Seeing that Haider didn't argue, Fern even poured him a glass of wine and handed it over, leaving Haider feeling like he'd trapped himself. But now he could only resist the temptation as he stood up and walked toward the kitchen. It's almost time to start cooking. Fern, would you like me to teach you? He asked, trying to change the subject. Cooking? Sure. Please teach me. But, could you drink this glass of wine first? Fern asked with innocent persistence. No, this. What's wrong? Fern tilted her head, looking at him curiously. Haider stammered, unsure how to get out of this situation, even casting a pleading glance at Ash. But Ash, remembering Haider's prior indifference to his own pleas, simply ignored him, crossing his legs and flipping through his book with a smirk. Chapter 76, Shocking Frieren. _________. While wandering through the central countries, Frieren happened to pass by the holy city. After a moment's thought, she decided to visit an old friend, though she wasn't entirely sure if her friends, who should be over 100 years old by now, were still alive. However, before she could locate her destination, she found herself lost in the forest on the city's outskirts. Just as she was considering using flight magic, she encountered a child carrying a basket. When she mentioned wanting to find Haider's home, the child, who initially seemed indifferent, unexpectedly revealed that she was a guest there and kindly led her to a cabin nestled in the woods. But before she could meet Haider, she noticed someone reclining in a chair in the yard, a figure she hadn't seen in over 20 years yet somehow missed deeply. She stood there, frozen, staring blankly, as if doubting her own eyes or perhaps suspecting she was under a mental illusion. Ash, seated in a newly purchased rocking chair, was basking in the sun, reading a book. Hearing footsteps, he assumed it was Fern returning, prompting him to discreetly hide his wine without a sound. However, when he looked up, he was taken aback. "Is that you, Frieren? It's been ages." "This is a rare sight," he said, surprised. "Is this Miss a friend of Master Ash?" Fern, who had led Frieren to the cabin, glanced at the unfamiliar elf with curiosity. She noticed Ash's attempt to conceal something and, frowning slightly, walked over. With a serious expression uncharacteristic for her usually blank demeanor, Fern grabbed the wine he'd hidden and chastised him. "Lord Haider said that no matter how good something is, moderation is key. 1 cup a day at most. You also promised me that you'd try to live long enough to decipher the magic book, and to be here until I come of age, right?" "Oh, well." Ash stammered, momentarily at a loss. "And what is this person's relationship to Master Ash?" "Well, it's a little complicated," he replied, feeling slightly embarrassed to be reprimanded by a child in front of Frieren. "But I guess you could say she's the friend I mentioned." Pushing aside the awkwardness, Ash stood up from the chair and greeted the long-lost elf girl with a warm smile, raising a hand in welcome. "It's been a while, Frieren. You look quite surprised to see me." Frieren nodded slowly, her expression a mix of astonishment and disbelief, leaving her momentarily speechless. Her mouth hung open as she tried to process the unexpected sight. She tilted her head unconsciously, and the suitcase she had been holding slipped from her grasp, falling to the ground, but she seemed entirely unaware. Her flustered reaction was so endearing that Ash couldn't help but chuckle. He approached her calmly, placed a gentle hand under her chin to close her gaping mouth, and lightly touched her head, stroking her familiar silver hair while steadying her gaze. While his intention was to help his long-absent friend, Fern watched him with an expressionless face, though her words carried a subtle note of reproach. "Master Ash, what are you doing? What are you doing? Close her mouth first, what if a bug flies in?" "And with her head tilted like that, she might end up with a crick in her neck," Fern remarked, clearly puzzled. "But why are you still touching her chin and hair even after doing all that?" Fern's eyes narrowed suspiciously, watching as Ash continued to stroke Frieren's chin and head, seemingly absorbed in the motion. Her young face took on an expression that was oddly serious for her age. Ash, however, replied seriously, "You know, Fern, I used to have a fluffy pet, and it would let me pet its chin just like this. And what does that have to do with your behavior now?" "Well, don't you think that her standing there so compliantly kind of shows she's waiting for me to pet her?" "I don't think so. And isn't it a bit inappropriate to treat a guest as if they were a pet? Stop it now." Fern finally couldn't watch any longer. She reached over and grabbed Ash, pulling him away from Frieren. She had also noticed that her blank expression was gradually changing to one of suppressed anger, her mind apparently snapping back to reality as her eyes sharpened. For Ash's safety, Fern kept a firm grip on him, attempting to lecture him on his behavior while fearing that Frieren, in her dazed yet growing irritation, might actually lash out. Meanwhile, Frieren slowly pieced together her thoughts, recovering from the shock of unexpectedly encountering her supposedly long-lost friend alive in the home of another friend she had assumed was nearing the end of his days. She felt she had every right to be furious and demand an explanation, but just as she took a step forward, brushing her disheveled hair back, the cabin door behind Ash opened, and another familiar figure appeared in her line of sight. The sight of this familiar hunched figure made Frieren pause, her anger melting into sheer astonishment. "This has to be a joke, right?" Hearing the commotion outside, Haider had rushed out, thinking it was just the usual squabble between Ash and Fern. But when he saw the silver-haired elf, he stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening in surprise. Frieren. You actually came to see me. So you're still alive, huh, you old drunkard. Haha, you're as heartless as ever, saying something like that the moment we meet. Or were you hoping I'd kicked the bucket already? Haider chuckled, his laughter rumbling as he opened the door wide, inviting them all to come inside. Frieren hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Ash before replying defensively, it's not that I actually wanted that, but, honestly, sometimes I do wish Ash would disappear. Every time he's about to die, he somehow just keeps hanging on. It's unsettling. And with that attitude of his, even I get annoyed. Ash remained calm, responding with a slight smile, I already told you, it's about your chin. No way, you're definitely just doing it because you find it amusing. Oh, did you figure me out? I feel a bit shy about that. Pretending. How long have we known each other? Frieren's voice dripped with disgust, but Ash's exaggeratedly bashful reaction, as he scratched his head with a sheepish grin, only deepened her disapproval. Deciding it wasn't worth arguing, she picked up her suitcase and strode briskly into the cabin. Fern, meanwhile, couldn't contain her curiosity any longer and asked Ash, are you really friends, Master Ash? Why do you ask? It's just, hearing her talk about you like that, it feels like you've known each other forever. Is Master Ash really over 100 years old? See? That's why you should treat me with care. I'm old. If you get me too excited, I might just die young, okay? In reality, even though 100 years wasn't long for a demon, Ash pretended otherwise. He put on a frail expression, not wanting to correct the misconception. But his words made Fern a bit unsettled. I want to be gentle, Master Ash, but sometimes you behave so recklessly. Yes, I'm at fault, it's my fault, Ash replied nonchalantly, pinching Fern's cheek playfully before hurrying after Frieren. Left on her own, Fern sighed, wondering how to balance being gentle with curbing Ash's impulsive behavior. In the crispness of late autumn, this phase of Haider's life brought him unexpected joy. Hosting his two old friends filled him with a rare sense of warmth. Though he was aged, his hands trembled, and his body wasn't as strong as it used to be, he was still determined to handle everything himself, letting Ash and Frieren talk as he prepared wine and food in the kitchen. It might have seemed strange to let a centenarian take on this responsibility, but, after all, everyone except Fern was older than him, and their years of camaraderie had naturally made them comfortable letting him play the host. As soon as Frieren put down her luggage, she sat by the dining table, propping her chin on her hand and casting Ash a somewhat hostile look. The earlier antics he had pulled still seemed to bother her. Seeing the tension, Fern quickly brought tea for both of them, then obediently went to the kitchen to assist Haider. Frieren's gaze followed Fern, curiosity flickering in her eyes. She couldn't resist asking, who's this child? Ash, smiling casually, answered, my great-granddaughter. Great-granddaughter? I see, so, wait, great-granddaughter. Great. The word registered slowly in Frieren's mind. Realization hit her, and she nearly jumped in shock, mouth hanging open, but her excitement made her inhale at the wrong moment. She choked on her tea, the bitterness biting into her throat as it splashed into her windpipe, causing her to cough and sputter uncontrollably. She clutched her chest, struggling to regain her breath. Ash, who had been ready for such a reaction, raised a small, diamond-shaped blue shield just in time to block the spray of tea. With an amused grin, he calmly sipped his own tea, watching Frieren's comical reaction with delight. Well, that was quite the reaction. I thought you'd be surprised, but I didn't expect you'd actually choke on your tea. Chapter 77, Did the Old Men Tacitly Betray the Elf? ________. Frieren took a long moment to calm herself after the initial shock. She continued to clutch her chest, trying to settle her racing heart, all while keeping her gaze fixed firmly on Ash. She finally managed to ask, though her voice was still tinged with disbelief, so, you already have a great-granddaughter. When did you get married? And why doesn't anyone know about it? Ash responded with an easy smile, what's so surprising about that? Isn't it perfectly normal for humans to marry and have children? True, but still, that's not the point. Frieren shook her head in exasperation. Why didn't you tell us? Didn't you know? Ash leaned back, a glint of mischief in his eyes. Actually, Fern's grandfather is Haider. Is that true? Frieren froze, clearly not expecting that answer. A long silence followed as she processed the revelation, before she suddenly leaned forward, bracing her hands against the table. However. Don't be so excited, that was just a bit of a joke, Ash said, noticing her reaction. He placed a gentle hand on her head, nudging her back into her seat, his chuckle warm as she stared at him, utterly bewildered. In truth, Fern is actually an orphan from the wars in the southern countries. Huh. Frieren's face darkened instantly, her tone a mixture of frustration and confusion. You were joking. About all of it. But, Ash replied without missing a beat, Haider genuinely treats her like a granddaughter. Impossible. Frieren shot back, shaking her head in firm disbelief. Neither of you is the kind to help out without reason. Her ancestor was once my adjutant and one of my closest friends, Ash explained, his voice calm. I had no clue about raising children, so I brought her here. Somehow, she and Haider have bonded quite well. Frieren opened her mouth, ready to speak, but Ash's unexpected revelation silenced her. Her thoughts were jumbled as she tried to process everything he'd just said. She felt an overwhelming mix of irritation, confusion, and even a bit of humor at his casual demeanor, uncertain whether to berate him or laugh. Ash, however, remained relaxed, sipping his tea as he continued to smile. But enough about my situation. Why are you here so suddenly? I was on my way to the holy city to buy something, Frieren replied, looking pointedly at the older men who had entered from the kitchen, evidently drawn by the noise. She hesitated before continuing. I also remembered that I owe Haider quite a few favors. I thought, since you're still alive, I might as well repay them before it's too late. Wait a minute, don't just repay Haider. What about my favors? I don't recall owing you anything. Oh, if Millie were still alive, she certainly wouldn't be so forgetful, Ash sighed, putting on an exaggerated look of disappointment, as if deeply wounded by her words. The mention of Millie reminded Frieren of a significant favor she owed Ash from 1,000 years ago. Their friendship was close and often marked by playful conflicts, and because of that, she'd set the debt aside all this time. But now, with him bringing it up, she couldn't help narrowing her eyes at his smug attitude, feeling both embarrassed and annoyed. I was going to repay you, but after this, I think sparing you a punch should be repayment enough. Haha. You two really have always had such a wonderful relationship. Noticing the tension, Haider calmly seated himself between them, his deep wrinkles softening with his gentle smile. He nodded, his voice warm. I'm honestly envious. It's not wonderful at all, it's just bad luck, Frieren muttered, turning her face away in frustration, clearly not wanting to deal with either of them anymore. It's a bad fate, but speaking of which. Haider didn't seem to mind. His gaze wandered to Fern, who was quietly peeling potatoes in the kitchen. Then he looked back at Ash with a knowing smile, recalling their last successful plan. Without any words exchanged, Ash seemed to catch on, nodding slightly. They both rose at the same time, leaving Frieren bewildered. What's going on? Come here for a moment. We need a favor from you. Ash and Haider spoke in unison, their synchronization uncanny and slightly unsettling. Frieren shivered at their excessive tacit understanding, feeling a strong sense of foreboding. These two were undoubtedly the most peculiar characters in the group, yet she trusted they meant no harm. Hesitating for only a moment, she followed them to Ash's room. This is the magic book of the sage Evasai, Ash said, handing her a worn tome on the table. Haider added with a smile, it contains the secrets of lost magic, resurrection of the dead and immortality. I've heard countless legends about that sort of magic, but does it really exist? Frieren, like Ash, was skeptical about magic that could grant immortality. She opened the book, her eyes scanning the densely packed symbols and cryptic sketches, many looking like they'd been stained or scribbled over. She nodded slightly. Using coded graphics. People from that era were really fond of this encryption style, but our request is that you help us decipher this book, Haider said with a calm smile. And during this time, we'd also like you to teach Fern magic, Ash added. Ash's own magic had been honed specifically for demonic spellcasting, making it less than ideal for instructing humans. He'd tried teaching, but found it uncomfortable, even awkward, so he abandoned the effort. Besides, Schlacht had advised him not to share the advanced magic of the future he had been taught. Ash didn't want to risk mixing up his knowledge and accidentally altering the future path Schlacht envisioned. Frieren, holding the book in her hands, looked at the two of them, realizing the weight of their request. Without overthinking it, she nodded, flipping through the pages. This isn't impossible. I can probably figure it out in 5 or 6 years. But are you both really afraid of death? Who isn't afraid of death? Haider turned his back to her, keeping his face calm, as if trying to hide any hint of vulnerability. I may not have shown it before, maybe to keep up appearances in front of everyone. But as I grow closer to it, I find myself fearing death more. I don't crave immortality, but I wouldn't mind buying a little more time. For the sake of the child? Of course. Even the scriptures say that we should strive for a healthy life, and longevity is the ultimate expression of health. You're quite the drinker, it's surprising to hear you say that. Haha. Ash said something similar once. You're both equally rude to an old man like me, Haider chuckled, not at all bothered, and left the room with a hearty laugh. Frieren, still holding the magic book, turned back to Ash with a puzzled expression. What about you? Are you afraid of death too? Of course. Isn't every human afraid of death? Really? Then you'd better hang on until I can decipher this, Frieren said with a slight nod. Her fingers traced the worn cover of the magic book, her expression turning somber as she added, but don't get your hopes up too high. I have a feeling that kind of magic might not really exist. It's okay. No matter the outcome, we won't hold it against you. During this time, please take care of Fern. That's fine, but can you please stop touching my hair all the time? You're really annoying. Frieren nodded in agreement, but when Ash reached out to touch her head, she grew visibly irritated, slapping his hand away. His habitual action seemed to truly bother her. But as she watched him walk away and the door closed behind him, an unexpected sense of loneliness crept over her. I wonder where Millie went. Perhaps she's dead. Or maybe I'll never see her again. With her master gone, Ash was the only friend left from 1,000 years ago. The thought that no one would tease her like this or ruffle her hair anymore gave her a fleeting sense of relief, but as she pondered it further, Frieren felt a pang of loneliness. While this old elf girl wrestled with melancholy inside the house, outside, the two old men raised their hands in a silent, victorious high five. How about a drink? Ash lifted a bottle, and Haider, after a brief hesitation, held up his glass. All right, just a bit. Not only did they high-five in celebration, but they even decided to have a few drinks, toasting the success of their plan. Of course, it would be unfair to call the two of them entirely unethical for tricking an old friend. Normally, if Frieren were asked to take on a disciple, she'd refuse outright, with past instances backing this up. Though their plan to keep Frieren around to train Fern seemed a bit underhanded, it wasn't overly exploitative either. 5 or 6 years might feel long to humans, but to Frieren, just as she'd previously said, a student might not even last if she wasn't cautious. She could easily pass this time by taking things a bit slow. To make amends, Haider prepared an exceptionally lavish dinner, although it might also have been because he was thrilled to have an old friend around. Unexpectedly, Frieren kept her promise, teaching Fern earnestly. With a mentor far surpassing anyone in the academy, Fern dedicated herself fully to her studies. Meanwhile, Ash was entirely liberated, frequently vanishing northward for a month or two at a time, returning each time as though he hadn't been gone at all. He would disappear periodically without sharing many details, but no one ever pressed for explanations, they all accepted it in silent agreement. As winter neared again, Frieren, who despised the cold, showed no desire to venture out. She stayed by the fire, basking in its warmth. Ash, having just returned from one of his trips, as usual, attempted to pull Fern onto his lap to serve as a human warmer, but Fern, who had just handed him a cup of hot tea, shrank back in resistance. Chapter 78, Childhood Recording, Pufferfish-like, The End of Hightower. After Frieren joined the large family living in the cabin in the woods, greatly raising the household's average age, the peaceful years began to drift by. As spring turned to autumn, Fern's hair gradually grew from shoulder length to her waist. But this winter, the snow outside the window was overwhelming, piling up thick on the ground. The wind outside continued to howl, fast and low, and Ash's heart felt as cold as the winter air. Such a sensible and well-behaved child. Is she now going through a rebellious phase? Sitting in the rocking chair, Ash felt lonely and sad, especially with the child he had raised now actively avoiding him. Frieren, huddled close to the fire to absorb as much warmth as possible, glanced over and confirmed. You were gone for half a year this time. Fern must have grown distant from you. You're clearly not an elf, yet you seem to understand children even less than I do. Is that so? Though the fireplace was crackling with warmth, the sight of the child he had raised becoming cold and distant left Ash feeling as if his heart had frozen over. Nearby, the old man sipping tea rolled his eyes at the conversation but didn't bother to correct anything. Fern, who was standing nearby, glared at Ash with puffed-up cheeks in silent protest. When Ash looked over, she turned away with a little huff, refusing to say a word, as if she wanted to keep her distance. It seemed impossible for adults to fully understand a child's moods. Perhaps this was the generation gap. Despite feeling a pang of regret, Ash still reached out, gently ruffling Fern's hair out of habit. Though she had plenty of reasons to be annoyed with him, Fern didn't resist the gesture, and her expression softened unconsciously. Even though she had long decided not to pry into Ash's affairs to avoid adding to his burdens, his sudden disappearances still left her worried. Under his gentle touch, she couldn't help but ask. Master Ash, why do you always leave? Well, I have a lot of things to take care of. What, are you going on dates or something? Dates? Hearing such a suggestion from Fern, Ash was taken aback, and then a gentle look of amusement appeared on his face, as if realizing she was growing up. Now, you actually know about dating. Lady Frieren said that Master Ash has vulgar desires and is always trying to watch shooting stars with women. Is this true? No, no, no. That's not vulgar at all, is it? Ash shook his head in exasperation, turning to glare at Frieren with clear displeasure. You're really teaching this kid some nonsense, huh? I didn't say anything vulgar, Frieren replied, waving her hands in mock innocence. Haider. Ash called out. What are you looking at me for? Haider shrugged, shaking his head. I don't think it's vulgar. Isn't this part of a man's romance? Exactly. Not vulgar at all. Emboldened by his ally's support, Ash straightened with confidence. Fern, don't think like that. Don't stain my noble soul with such dirty thoughts. Fern ignored him, turning to Haider with a dissatisfied frown. Lord Haider. With that disapproving look, Haider immediately changed his tune and pointed the finger at Ash instead. I was only kidding. Actually, yes, it is quite vulgar. As a man, you should avoid such behavior. Master Ash. Did you hear that? Lord Haider, the bishop, said so. Reflect on yourself and correct your mistakes immediately. Fern, who had suddenly turned from an enemy to a friend, puffed up her cheeks like a pufferfish and righteously demanded that Ash change his ways, leaving him dumbfounded. Is this really my fault? Of course. Ha. I suppose it's only natural that, as children grow up, they become a little more rebellious and a little less friendly. Ash didn't argue with her but instead quietly took out a treasured magical item from his pocket. He infused it with a bit of magic, and suddenly, a recording of young Fern's voice filled the room. If it weren't for Master Ash, I would have died on the roadside. It was Master Ash who gave me hot meals and a clean bed. He gave me a home. He was there for me whenever I felt uneasy. Wait a minute. What is this? Fern, who had been puffing up her face, quickly recognized her own voice and, red-faced, rushed forward to try and snatch it away. But Ash stood up and dodged her attempts, all while sighing with feigned regret. The young Fern was so sweet and always said she loved me the most, but the current Fern. Oh, I guess I miss little Fern. When did you record this? Please, hand over that weird thing, now. Nope. I'm really angry. I won't give it to you, even if you're mad. It's my spiritual support. Losing it would be like losing my soul. Even when Fern threw herself at him, standing on tiptoes in a desperate attempt to grab it, Ash did not give in and happily continued playing it until the recording reached its end. Defeated, Fern clenched her fists and puffed up her young face, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and continued to glare at him. To be honest, her expression was rather cute and not intimidating at all, so Ash had no intention of compromising and even proudly showed off his treasured item to Frieren. Frieren couldn't help but nod approvingly. You really have some precious stuff there. I never thought the usually cold Fern could have had such an adorable phase. That's right. The two of them happily continued chatting together, but the price of their teasing was that Fern turned her back with a pout and ignored them both for the entire night. Even the next day, Haider did not intercede on their behalf, leaving the two of them to apologize to her one after another. Yet, even after both apologies, Fern only forgave Frieren, still holding a grudge against Ash, who stubbornly refused to hand over the recording or explain further. As a result, Fern maintained a cold war with him for several days, ultimately forcing Ash to decide not to use his winning item so easily again until a truly critical moment. In truth, it wasn't that Ash wanted to withhold what he did, he simply often failed to clarify his actions properly. Apart from visiting the Magic City, most of the other places he traveled to included the royal capital and the Demon King's castle. Within the Demon King's castle resided two great demons, the corrupted sage and the bloody god of war. One could teach him advanced, innovative magic, while the other offered instruction in martial arts. Moreover, the two of them were extremely powerful, and if they weren't careful, they could stir up considerable trouble outside the castle walls. If Ash didn't go there regularly, it would be difficult to keep the situation fully under control. And, of course, Ash also sought to improve his own skills, which motivated him to make frequent trips to the Demon King's castle. If Ash didn't visit the Demon King's castle regularly, countless towns and villages around the world would suffer. Qual, while an intense researcher who rarely left his studies, was relatively low risk. But Rivali, a berserker, constantly sought worthy warriors to battle, even planning a visit to Warrior Village to find a challenger capable of facing his most powerful attacks. He ultimately decided against it, though, as a more promising opponent was anticipated. Fortunately, Rivali's focus remained on the Demon King's castle without proclaiming himself the Demon King, sparing the world from greater trouble. Over time, however, the cozy, harmonious atmosphere of the woodland cabin began shifting toward a heavier, more solemn tone, largely due to Haider's declining health. His coughing fits grew more frequent and echoed even in the quiet of night. While magic could heal external injuries, it was powerless against disease and aging, something even Fern had come to recognize. The signs were unmistakable. Haider's life was drawing to a close. One day, after Haider had stumbled and been confined to bed for recovery, a concerned Fern couldn't help but ask Frieren anxiously, "Lady Frieren, is there no progress on that magic book? Can't we speed things up a bit?" Frieren seemed to hesitate, caught between saying something and holding back. "I think that book's magic might be," she paused, then shook her head. "Never mind. Don't worry, I'll do my best to speed up." Meanwhile, in Haider's room, Ash sat beside the bed, arms crossed, observing his old friend with an unreadable expression. Haider, bedridden and needing rest, looked back with a familiar smile. "After this, that child will depend on you," Haider murmured. "Isn't it a little early to start saying your goodbyes?" Ash replied. "But it probably won't be long now." Ash exhaled quietly. "Fair enough. Forgive me." "For what, exactly?" "For a lot of things." Haider's eyes closed slowly, his expression calm. Instead of fear, he seemed filled with a deep nostalgia, holding on to memories he was reluctant to release. In the days that followed, Fern dedicated herself to practicing magic, driven by the promise she'd made with Haider in Ash's absence. She poured his energy into offensive spells, targeting the rocks along the cliffside of the mountain's back edge. Her goal was clear: to establish herself as an independent magician and allow Haider, who had become like a grandfather to her, to pass on peacefully, knowing his legacy was secure. Realizing he likely wouldn't live much longer, Haider began wondering if he should reveal the truth to Frieren, that he and Ash had orchestrated a bit of a deception to secure her presence as Fern's mentor. Chapter 79, Even until the end of your life, I will protect you. Because of Ash's unique circumstances, Haider wasn't entirely sure how long he could count on him to care for Fern. So before Frieren left, he hoped that Fern would at least be able to keep up with one of the two or, ideally, have the skills to support herself by the time he passed, giving him some peace of mind. After all, just as Fern saw him as her grandfather, Haider truly thought of this young life, the last he encountered in his own, as his granddaughter. Ash, understanding Haider's concerns, looked at the frail and weary old man lying in bed and sighed, "I understand what you're hoping for, but you've misunderstood something. At this point, I could never abandon her. And honestly, she's nearly self-sufficient already. She's basically grown up and can make her own way. So there's not much to worry about. But then Haider asked him something unexpected, with a hint of mischief and perhaps something deeper, which caught Ash off guard. To tell the truth, what exactly is Fern to you? Fern. She's a child, right? What else would she be? Ash replied with genuine surprise. He had raised Fern, watched her grow, and the thought of her as anything other than a child simply didn't cross his mind. Haha. Indeed, to us, she's always been a child, Haider chuckled softly. Then, with a slightly more serious tone, he added, but children grow up. Someday, she'll become a graceful young woman, and though you won't age, at least in appearance, you'll look like peers. Only in appearance, right? When she was young, she could see you as a father figure, but as she matures and appears as you do, can she really still see you that way? I think it might be difficult. Don't you agree? Haider's gaze and tone, unusually protective, made Ash a bit uncomfortable, almost like Haider was suddenly acting like a grandfather protecting his granddaughter. This made Ash raise an eyebrow, finding the implication both amusing and strange. What are you imagining all the time? Ash replied lightly, trying to brush off the mood. She's practically family, a younger sister, isn't she? No blood relation, Haider reminded him. Fine, then the older brother next door. A brother next door who's cared for her since she was little, Haider pressed on, think about what that means. All right, I'll think about it. We can put this aside for now, Haider said with a hint of humor. But just consider this, she'll look like she's in her 20s soon enough, and what about you? A neighbor's brother? Ash said, sighing. Oh, don't make me overthink this. I'm the elder here, and even if she seems rebellious now, I'm sure she respects me at heart. As she grows up, she'll continue to see me as an elder, I'm certain. Even if she feels that way, what about you? Haider raised an eyebrow, as if waiting for Ash to understand the point he was making. Haven't you always wanted to find a nice girl to watch the stars with? Fern is quite cute now, and she'll only become more charming as she matures, right? Ash was so surprised by Haider's implication that he almost laughed aloud. Giving a clear answer without hesitation, he said, who do you think I am? How could I ever think of a child I've raised that way? If it came down to it, I'd sooner consider a demon, an angel, or an ancient elf before even thinking about Fern in such a way. Haider's wild suspicion struck Ash as so absurd that he nearly took a vow right then and there. In addition to the years they had spent together since childhood, there was a more practical reason Ash hesitated, a fundamental issue that came down to their difference in lifespans. He recalled an incident he and Haider had encountered on their travels, a dwarf who had married a human wife. Inevitably, the human wife passed away early, while the dwarf husband was left to guard her grave in the village, likely to continue his vigil for countless years to come. Such stories only reinforced what history had already shown, that unions between those with vastly different life expectancies often led to inevitable heartache. Even if they could overcome other barriers, he knew that one day, he would witness Fern age and grow frail while he remained unchanged. This reality weighed heavily on him. Reflecting on all this, Haider sighed with a hint of helplessness but said nothing more. His gaze drifted to the ceiling as he murmured, almost faintly, then, let me pray for you from heaven when the time comes. Stop worrying so much. Just live honestly, Ash replied, his tone gentle but firm. Haha, you're right, Haider whispered with a weak smile before closing his eyes, while Ash turned his gaze to the window, avoiding the sight of his ailing friend. Outside, as though sharing in the old man's weariness, a heavy downpour pounded against the window. The rain, relentless and fierce, created an illusion that the end of days was near. Ash sat silently for a long time, his expression contemplative, before he suddenly spoke, but, regardless of everything, you really don't need to worry. No matter what happens during her life, or how she eventually views me, I'll protect Fern until her final days. I do this not for you, but because I can't bear to see the child I've watched grow come to harm. That's more than I could have asked for. But still, I can't help but feel sorry for you, Haider replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Forget it. This is my choice. Really? Well, thank you. I'll leave her to you from now on. Their conversation reached an unspoken end, with only the hum of wind and rain filling the room, underscoring the fragile quiet. After some time, Ash left Haider's room, letting the older man rest. In the living room, Frieren sat slumped at the dining table, her expression visibly heavier than the two men's. She had just returned from outside, and rainwater dripped steadily from her soaked clothes, but she seemed too distracted to care. Shaking his head, Ash grabbed a towel and tossed it at her face, blocking her view. Frieren, already in a low mood, pulled the towel from her face, glaring at him in annoyance. "I'm not in the mood for this right now. Don't mess around with me like this, especially at a time like this. You're an adult now, you know better," Ash said, his tone admonishing but gentle. "If you don't take care of yourself, you won't have the strength to handle everything else. What if you catch a cold? Magic won't cure that. I know that." "You don't have to tell me," she muttered, looking away unhappily. But despite her reluctance, she still walked toward the bathroom with the towel. Just before she closed the door, she paused, not turning back as she said, "Fern's still on the mountain. You should go check on her. It wouldn't do if something happened to her out there in this storm." "I already know that without you reminding me," Ash responded, "but I'll bring Fern down shortly. Once you're done with your shower, make us a meal, something the kid would enjoy, if possible. You still don't fully understand her. What's that supposed to mean? I just don't think she'll come down so easily." "Well, I'll bring her down anyway." Ash shrugged slightly, grabbed an umbrella, opened the door, and stepped out into the storm. Although he tried to keep his exit composed, the relentless wind and rain forced him to open the umbrella immediately, which promptly broke under the pressure of the elements, drenching his face in cold rain. "That kid, still so stubborn," Frieren muttered, watching him vanish into the rain. She dried her face, sighed, then simply took off into the air, disappearing like a flash of lightning. In mere moments, Ash reached the back mountain, finding himself at the edge of a bare cliff that overlooked the forest below. Standing there, a purple-haired girl with waist-length hair faced the distant rocks on the opposite side, bracing herself against the strong wind and pounding rain. Unfazed by the harsh weather, she was repeatedly casting a basic attack spell, ordinary human magic refined from lethal combat magic. Over and over, she focused on sending light toward the other side of the cliff, aiming for the boulders across the gap. But each time, the spell lost strength in midair, succumbing to the wind and fading before reaching its destination. Ash observed for a while, then approached and placed his hand on Friren's head. "Take it easy," he said gently. "You're not ready yet." "No, there's no time left," she replied, turning to meet his gaze in the pouring rain. "Neither you nor Lord Haider have much time remaining. If Lady Frieren can't manage it, then I want to prove I can survive alone." Her words held a resolve so firm that it seemed unshakable. Ash knelt to her level, studying her eyes. After a thoughtful pause, he smiled warmly, and in a soft voice said, "This will be our secret. Don't tell anyone, not even Frieren." "What?" she asked, caught off guard. "Actually, I'm not like Haider. I'm different. My body is strong enough to endure. I'll be here to witness your future, to protect you as long as you live." "Really?" "Of course," he replied with an unwavering tone. "I swear to you, no matter what happens or how things may change between us, I will never leave your side." There was an unmistakable certainty in his voice, and his gentle gaze held a warmth so profound that Fern's eyes widened in shock. Despite the seeming impossibility of his words, she couldn't bring herself to doubt him. In fact, she didn't want to. Ash didn't say anything more, merely rested his hand on her head in a way that soothed her, gradually softening her rigid stance until she nearly melted under his touch. She felt a desire to fall into his embrace, as she had often done in the past. Before she could make the decision, Ash pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her with the same gentleness as always, enveloping her in the warmth she knew so well. She surrendered completely, letting herself fall into the comfort and familiarity of his embrace, trusting in the promise he had just given her. Chapter 80, Frieren's Little Regret, You Are Actually Scheming Against Me. _____________. Though the heavy rain kept the air cold, being in Ash's arms filled Fern with a warmth that seemed to envelop her like the entire world's embrace. To her, it was no exaggeration, right now, even if offered the entire world, she wouldn't trade this closeness for anything. Without realizing it, the sadness and panic in her heart melted away. Long gone was the stubborn resistance she once felt as a young girl. Instead, she leaned into him, unconsciously holding onto him tightly. As they stood in the rain, Ash began to think it wasn't wise to linger. He lifted her the same way he used to when she was young, gently settling her into the crook of his arms as though she were still a small child. Master Ash. What are you doing? The sudden lift made Fern feel more embarrassed than alarmed, as she was concerned he might struggle under her weight, despite his magical strength, and suggest she walk on her own. But, to her surprise, just as when she was younger, his arm remained steady and unshaken, holding her securely. Let's head back now. Staying out in the rain like this isn't good, especially since you haven't eaten yet. You must be hungry, right? I've already prepared a table of food. Well, if you say so. At this point, Fern, unable to resist further, nodded and yielded. Though she was much taller now, making it a little awkward to sit in his arms, and feeling quite shy, she quietly reached out, wrapped her arms around his neck, and rested her cheek against his. Her expression softened, becoming more relaxed than she'd felt in a long time. Amid the heavy rain, she even closed her eyes. No matter how fierce the wind blew or how uncertain the future felt, right now, she had someone she could rely on completely, someone with whom she could reveal her vulnerability, and even, if only for a moment, act a little spoiled. When Ash decided to forego flying and walk down the hill in the rain, he finally returned to the cabin and opened the door. The aroma of food immediately greeted him. As soon as he set the hungry Fern down, she, though reluctant to part, quickly released him upon meeting Frieren's surprised gaze. With a slight blush of embarrassment, she dashed off to the bathroom, concealing her emotions. After a refreshing bath, Fern returned to the table, ravenously devouring her meal, forgetting any ladylike manners she might normally observe. Frieren, meanwhile, sat at the table, watching Fern while propping her chin on one hand, then glanced at Ash, who was about to head for his own bath, with an amused look in her eyes. You really surprised me. You managed to convince her to come down. I told you I would, didn't I? Indeed, it seems you understand people better than I do. Oh, don't flatter me. If I couldn't manage that, I'd be a fool, wouldn't I? Ash chuckled, shaking his head as he closed the bathroom door behind him. By the time he emerged, Fern had already finished eating and even cleared away her dishes. Yet, there she was, still sitting at the table, her head resting on it as she looked at him with a small pout. And what's that look for? The way Frieren's expression shifted, like turning a page, left Ash watching her in confusion. But Frieren only shook her head, choosing not to say anything. Fern, still lying on the table, muttered aloud, I thought Master Ash had cooked the meal. Are you saying Frieren's cooking isn't tasty? Ash asked. No. It's just what? From the atmosphere, shouldn't it have been Master Ash who prepared the meal? Don't be greedy. Contentment is key, Ash said, patting her head gently. He gestured toward Frieren, still engrossed in deciphering the magic book, and added, I'm already perfect enough. If I could also cook, how would someone as flawed as Frieren stand a chance? Hey, isn't it a bit mean to talk like that? Frieren glared at him in protest. But Ash simply chuckled and continued with his lesson, anyway, that's the deal. A person has to learn to be satisfied with what they have. But still, right now, I really wanted to eat something made by Master Ash. But life has its regrets, he teased with a grin. The playful banter between Ash and Fern eased the atmosphere, lifting the somber mood that had settled around them. Meanwhile, Frieren, who'd been somewhat forgotten in their exchange, couldn't shake the feeling that she deserved an apology for Ash's earlier jab. Besides, was she becoming the third wheel here? And the thought crossed her mind, it might be better to just ignore him and leave him to grow old on his own. After all, if she didn't do that, she might get so angry at him that her own life would be cut short, and she'd probably end up dying even earlier than him. It was almost funny to imagine. Although Frieren entertained the idea of giving Ash the silent treatment, she ultimately sighed, grumbled under her breath, and went back to decoding the magic book with renewed vigor. Watching her, Ash felt a mix of guilt over the deception he and Haider had maintained for so long. While he could understand why young Fern might not suspect anything, Frieren's prolonged obliviousness was harder to fathom. If a spell for immortality truly existed, would a sage like Haider be so resigned to die? Did he simply feel he had overstayed his welcome? Even if he could have been slain, surely others would fight over such magic. How could such power remain exclusively in Haider's possession? The whole idea seemed incredibly unlikely. But as he thought about it, He remembered Frieren's unwavering faith in a charm Flem had taught her ages ago, believing it was a foolproof spell of attraction. She hadn't doubted it for over 1,000 years. If he looked at it that way, he might just be able to keep her in the dark indefinitely. The thought amused him, and he couldn't help wondering how long it would take before Frieren began to notice that there was something unusual about him. Meanwhile, time slipped by. Haider's life slowly ebbed away. Fern, too, continued developing her talents. With a sharp mind for magic and a gifted mentor, her progress was steady. About 1.5 years after her fall from the tower had left her barely able to walk, and 6 years since Frieren had come to live with them, 15-year-old Fern finally succeeded in hitting the rocks on the other side of the cliff with her magic. Ecstatic, she immediately ran back to share her success with the elderly men who treated her like family. Haider's laughter, full of joy, echoed through the room once again. Just a few days later, Frieren completed her work on the magic book. However, there's no magic for immortality, no spell for resurrecting the dead, not even a way to extend a person's life, Frieren said softly, placing the fully deciphered book on Haider's bedspread. Despite the news, Haider remained unexpectedly calm, as though he'd been anticipating it. He replied casually, "I see. The reward for your efforts is in the table drawer, feel free to take it." "You knew all along, didn't you?" Frieren asked, suspicion edging her tone. "Because if there were such a spell, wouldn't the sage have used it himself?" Haider replied so matter-of-factly that Frieren was immediately perplexed. "Then, why make me go through all of this?" "You'll have to ask Ash about that," he said with a slight smile. Ash. Frieren was taken aback, and as she recalled that scene from 6 years prior, her frown deepened. "Don't tell me, you both were plotting against me." Though there might be some truth in that, Ash, who had been lingering by the door, interjected, preemptively defending himself, "It's not fair to those who were deceived, is it? How was I supposed to know you'd actually believe it and work overtime to decipher it? I even told you not to push yourself too hard. At the time, I thought you were genuinely concerned for my health," she snapped. "What are you talking about? You've been slacking off for years. Putting in a little effort isn't a bad thing, though I was concerned that the harder you worked, the more annoyed you'd get with us." He shrugged, hands spread in a frank admission of his initial intent. Frieren ground her teeth in frustration. "After everything, that's your attitude? All right, I admit I was wrong." "I'm sorry," he said, bowing his head in apology before she could lose her temper further. Haider, watching them with a grin, raised his hand in solidarity. "Same here. If you're mad, feel free to take a swing at me." "How could I possibly do that? If I had to hit someone, it'd be this idiot," she huffed, glancing in Ash's direction. "Hey, I'm over 100 too, you know," Ash said, gesturing to himself in mock self-defense. Yet his youthful appearance made his words seem almost cheeky, which only further irritated Frieren. "Even if you were to pass away, people would probably breathe a sigh of relief," she shot back coldly. Though she scolded him, Frieren held back from actually lashing out. After a tense moment, she finally exhaled, suppressing her irritation. "So, enough games. What are you two really planning?" "Nothing underhanded," Ash replied with a soft smile. "Just wanted to repay a debt. What's truly needed now is for you to take Fern with you when you leave." "Isn't this essentially asking you to take on a disciple?" Haider added, chuckling. "She's more than capable now and should be able to help you in many ways. Now, you don't really have a reason to refuse, do you? You two really did set me up." Frieren exclaimed, a mixture of exasperation and reluctant amusement in her voice. "Haha, well, regardless, you two should set off tonight." "As you can tell, I don't have much time left," Haider said, ignoring her frustration. His usual cheerfulness shone through as he continued, "I don't want the child to go through the pain of losing someone close again. So, Frieren, I'm entrusting her to you. This is my final request." Frieren paused. "Shouldn't you be saying this to Ash?" But she quickly realized something was amiss and stopped mid-sentence. Haider offered a knowing smile. "I already discussed it with Ash 1.5 years ago. You too. You made this decision without even telling us," she protested, though her voice softened. "I'm sorry," Haider said quietly. But Frieren's gaze softened as well. "Haider, No need to act so noble right now. Fern's already prepared to say goodbye. Before that happens, what you need to do is share a proper farewell with her. Leave her with as many memories as you can. During this conversation, Frieren sat back in her chair, unable to bear the emotions welling within her. She lowered her head, trying to suppress them, but her shoulders and voice shook uncontrollably. Tears spilled down her face, dripping onto her hands, completely betraying the sorrow she felt. It wasn't just the grief for Fern, the child she'd watched over for 6 years, it was also the heartbreak of soon losing an old friend. Seeing her collapse, Haider looked troubled but offered a small, regretful smile. Though you seem cold and indifferent like ash, you're actually very gentle. Frieren. Leave me alone. She turned away, her trembling hands clenching her skirt. Yet, when she felt a familiar hand on her head, she couldn't help but let out a choked complaint, Ash too. Don't touch my head. Don't complain. I wouldn't mind if someone would do the same for me. He glanced toward Haider. This guy still calls me heartless after everything. It's not easy for me to keep a straight face. Ash and Haider exchanged a smile, their usual banter lightly mocking their old friend even at this somber moment. Haider, despite his own sadness, smiled and said, "Look at you, Frieren's already in tears. Why don't you let me see a tear or two from you?" No, no, no. At your age, this is practically a happy farewell. Why should I cry? Or, do you have any regrets left? Of course I do. I was hoping to attend your wedding with Fern. T/N. That might be difficult. How about I go ahead and marry them tomorrow? Now that's an idea. 3 wishes granted at once. Their light-hearted banter slowly lifted the heavy atmosphere, unknowingly easing the sadness. Frieren gradually stopped crying and trembling, her gaze settling on Haider's face, now lined with time's traces. The vitality and brightness that had once filled their youth had long softened, subtly fading without notice. Yet, in this moment, she began to understand the concept of aging in a new way. It didn't feel as heavy or frightening as she'd once thought. For in her time with Haider, she'd come to see aging as a natural rhythm of life, like the changing seasons, each phase holding its own unique essence. It wasn't envy she felt, but rather an unexpected realization of a truth she may have never otherwise grasped. Chapter 81, Temporary Separation, Aura just wants to be willful. ________. Feeling deeper understanding from Haider, Frieren realized that she and Fern should probably be complaining about their unusual jokes, but she let it be. At least, for now, they could joke freely. Watching the two chat so cheerfully, though she still found their humor odd, she simply looked on with a slight smile, a mixture of tolerance and a little helplessness. After Ash finished speaking with Haider, he left the room alongside Frieren. Later, Fern entered the room herself, sitting beside Haider's bed with a smile, chatting and laughing with him. The time that followed was filled with warmth and joy. But as Haider himself had sensed, only half a month later, his life quietly came to an end. On a bright morning, he passed peacefully in his sleep. Frieren, discovering him first, quickly informed the others of the sad news. Fern, overwhelmed, threw herself into Ash's arms, sobbing uncontrollably as he comforted her. Haider, having once been a bishop, had requested that his funeral be modest. Besides the 3 of them, only a handful of villagers and a few priests from nearby attended. His grave was placed simply in the city cathedral's cemetery. Despite his notable past, his tombstone was a humble stone marker, unadorned and unpretentious. After the brief funeral, the 3 stayed a little longer. Frieren approached the tombstone and poured some wine she'd brought 6 years earlier, fulfilling a promise she made with Haider when Himmel passed. Then, the 3 packed their things and set off together. But about 2 months later, after Fern's emotions had fully settled, Ash used an important errand as a reason to part ways for a while, planning to return in time to celebrate Fern's birthday. After all, no matter how he looked at Frieren's long, meandering journey, he just couldn't bring himself to follow obediently the entire way. But his sudden departure left Fern quite upset. It feels bad. He just leaves so casually. I'm the one unlucky enough to be left behind, she complained, her cheeks puffed up in irritation as she watched him fade into the distance. Frieren, watching Fern's reaction, was equally upset and couldn't help silently blaming Ash for being so inconsiderate. But Fern, too focused on Ash's retreating figure, missed Frieren's displeased look. Watching him disappear from view, she silently swore to herself that she'd be very cross with him the next time they met. Over the years, Ash had often left for various, important errands, his reasons always seeming casual, yet they had grown accustomed to his coming and going. Each time Ash left, he either traveled to the magical city or set out to find the demons. Since he often went among the demons, he naturally couldn't reveal his exact destination or purpose to them. Although he'd promised to protect Fern, he couldn't follow her for the rest of his life. Besides, with Frieren around, he felt reassured enough to leave them occasionally. In the heart of Esther Kingdom's royal capital, under Ash's covert control, 2 demon girls, one older, one younger, were beginning to live without much concern about being discovered. If you ask why, it's naturally because everyone in the royal city has been instilled with loyalty to Ash from a young age. Through scientific education, systematic training, information management, and other methods over the past 80 years, loyalty has been thoroughly ingrained. And to ensure obedience, they have also voluntarily accepted binding magic, so even if they saw something unexpected, it wouldn't be an issue. As Ash entered the audience hall, he spotted a pink-haired girl with 2 horns, sitting arrogantly on the throne. Holding a scale in her hand, she was casting obedience magic on a man who was pinned to the ground by knights, unable to move. Despite the years, she hadn't grown taller or changed in appearance, but Aura looked entirely qualified as a beautiful queen. Her bust was quite impressive, and while she remained petite, it was manageable, but her personality, that was another matter. Oh, isn't this my brother? Here again today. Lots of work to do, huh? Aura, on the throne, noticed Ash instantly and flashed a bright, teasing smile. There were already plenty of people loyal to him, but Ash still felt obligated to handle the core aspects. Now, facing her teasing, he just wore an expression of hidden irritation as he ascended the steps. Have you never thought about sharing the workload? No, not at all. This is your responsibility, after all, Aura replied, stretching her arms wide, her face gleaming with triumph. Even if everyone in the entire royal city has been educated to be loyal to you and could willingly accept obedience magic, it's still thanks to me casting those spells that you can feel at ease. In other words, no matter how you think about it, I'm already the biggest contributor, right? Even so, you. Oh, forget it. He had intended to encourage her to make a bit more effort, but considering Aura's character, he gave up immediately. But his disdainful look, and the decisiveness with which he abandoned the topic, hurt Aura's pride. She dismissed her attendants, quickly rushing down and frowning as she stopped in front of him. Standing on tiptoe, she looked up at him directly. I felt for a long time that your attitude toward me has been far too rude, don't you think? So. Do you think I'm a fool? Absolutely. But that's not the point. He ignored Aura's increasingly dangerous gaze, reached out to grab her horn, and gently pushed her away. It's been so many years, you should have a little self-awareness by now, right? Even if you are a demon, you ought to make some progress. You actually look down on me that much. That's not it. Really. I just think you're stupid, but you're actually quite useful, so I can't really say I look down on you. Go to hell. Without hesitation, he answered, and a chilling aura immediately filled the air. Aura raised her hand in an instant, casting a lethal spell. A dark purple beam of light surged out, but Ash's light blue diamond shield blocked it effortlessly. Watching the decorations around him blown away by the shockwave, he gathered gravity lightning in his right hand and swept it outward forcefully. The beam of dark magic instantly dissipated, vanishing in a flash of light. Aura, who had thought this move might have some effect on Ash and had never anticipated such a poor outcome, stamped her foot angrily. What? You said you were kind enough to teach me this magic, yet you have something even better. It's just ordinary gravity magic. No. That's definitely not normal. Normally, it wouldn't just be defeated so easily. You could actually tell. You've improved, Aura. Ash stepped forward, patting Aura on the head with a satisfied smile. Isn't it normal? If I don't guard against you, who knows what you'd pull? Where's that brotherly bond you promised me? You're the one who said, okay. Wouldn't it be wrong not to keep a little distance? I never thought you'd be so heartless. You're hardly one to say that to me, right? He gently pushed Aura aside and headed toward the study, which had once belonged to the king but had now become his private sanctuary. Aura, who had been full of indignation a moment ago, quickly regained her composure as he turned away. She took out a handkerchief and rubbed the spot on her horn he had touched, muttering in irritation, clearly, trying to play the brother-sister card still isn't very effective. Is guilt-tripping him completely useless? Honestly, how long do you think I've known you? And you're still using these tricks on me? What exactly are you plotting? Ash glanced at Aura out of the corner of his eye, feeling exasperated. He couldn't fathom why this girl, despite her good looks and figure, had such an unusual personality. A normal demon should have been, well, a little less like this. Was it his fault? Had he somehow corrupted her when she was young? Even now, he still felt a pang of regret. With that thought, he sat down at his desk and opened up the important documents that required his attention for the kingdom. Aura, however, perched herself right on the desk, swinging her legs back and forth, whining petulantly, "Ash, I'm bored, stop what you're doing. Tell me what. Find me something to do. Give me a massage if you're so bored. No, that's even more boring. Then practice your magic. Already did. Then keep going. No. I'm so bored. Come on, talk to me." This pink-haired demon girl was as demanding as ever. She slapped his papers away and leaned onto the desk, staring at him intently, her stubborn willfulness showing in her eyes. Ash sighed deeply for what felt like the 100th time while dealing with this peculiar girl. "I'm not saying this to be harsh, Aura, but you are talking about me." Before he could even finish, Aura interrupted, displeased. Dealing with this headstrong girl always took patience, but he simply nodded and said, "All right, yes, I'm talking about you."